Hello there, and welcome to All About Earth, where science drifts slowly and curiosity feels at home. Wherever you are tonight, maybe sinking into a soft couch wrapped in a warm blanket, or resting under a quiet field of stars, I'm glad you're here. Take a moment, take a breath. The air that fills your lungs right now is ordinary, invisible, effortless. But billions of years ago, it would have been poison. Oxygen, the gas that keeps us alive, was once Earth's deadliest experiment. Tonight, we're traveling back roughly 2.4 billion years to a time before trees, before animals, even before color as we know it. The oceans were dark, rich with metals, the skies thick and strange. Life existed, but only as tiny, patient cells, microbes that floated in silence, quietly rewriting the chemistry of the planet. And somewhere in that stillness, something began to change. Some of those microbes learned a trick so powerful it would reshape the entire world. They learned to use light to pull energy from the sun, and in doing so, to release oxygen. They didn't mean to start a revolution. They were just surviving. But that small act set off a chain of events that nearly ended life itself. It's known today as the Great Oxidation Event, or GOA, the first global catastrophe. Long before ice ages or mass extinctions, when oxygen, the very breath we depend on, became a toxin, the world that had nurtured early life suddenly turned against it. Entire ecosystems vanished. For a while it looked as though Earth might empty itself of life completely. It's strange to think about, isn't it? That breathing this quiet, ordinary thing once nearly destroyed everything that made it possible. Before we dive deeper into that story, take another breath. Feel how light it is, how easy. Somewhere in that air are molecules born from the same process that once caused chaos. The legacy of those ancient microbes is still with us in every inhale. So, as you settle in, whether under the soft weight of your blanket or listening to the hush of the night outside, let curiosity breathe with you. If you enjoy wandering through these quiet corners of deep time, you can like, share, or subscribe so we can keep exploring together. Tonight's journey begins with the planet's first great mistake, a time when life invented oxygen and almost ended itself. The first atmosphere, Earth without oxygen. Before oxygen, before blue skies, before anything that could be called fresh air, Earth breathed something else entirely. The atmosphere, if you could stand in it, which you couldn't, was a thick, shimmering haze of methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. The smell would have been unbearable, the taste metallic and sour, the very air toxic to the lungs we now take for granted. But there were no lungs then, no leaves or birds or waves of grass to move with the wind. There was only a heavy, alien sky and an ocean that seemed to glow faintly under a dimmer sun. The time was more than 2.5 billion years ago. The planet was already old, formed, scarred, and restless. Volcanoes dotted its surface like fiery punctuation marks, each one breathing out gases that shaped the world's first atmosphere. Carbon dioxide poured out in endless streams, thickening the air and trapping heat. Methane from primitive microbes and geochemical reactions added a faint orange tint to the sky, scattering light in strange ways, perhaps giving sunsets of copper and blood. Ammonia leaked from vents and boiling pools, lending a sharp chemical note to the mix. If you had been there, your eyes, if eyes had existed, would have seen a world cloaked in haze, veiled and secretive. There was no oxygen yet, no ozone layer to filter sunlight. Ultraviolet rays rained down unimpeded, splitting molecules, sparking reactions, rewriting chemistry in every corner of the atmosphere. Clouds drifted low, dense with volcanic dust and water droplets too heavy to linger. Lightning cracked through the haze, igniting fleeting storms that flashed and vanished, each bolt a laboratory of raw creation. In those storms, molecules collided and combined in new ways, forming amino acids, simple sugars, and the fragile threads of what would someday become life. The oceans beneath that sky were not blue but dark and metallic. They shimmered with dissolved iron, rich in minerals, leached from an active crust. Hydrothermal vents bubbled along the seafloor, releasing clouds of hot water laced with hydrogen sulfide, methane, and metals. The smell would have been like burnt matches and rust, but down there in the warmth and chemical chaos, life had already taken root. Not life as we know it, No plants, no animals, not even cells with nuclei, but tiny anaerobic microbes, ancient bacteria and archaea, invisible yet resilient. They didn't need oxygen, in fact, it would have killed them. They drew energy from chemistry itself, from iron, sulfur, and hydrogen. Some fed on the gases, erupting from volcanic vents. Others thrived in the shallows, feeding on dissolved compounds washed in from the rocks. They were the planet's first citizens, single-celled alchemists, turning mineral reactions into life. Their world was one of contrasts, hot vents and cold currents, lightless depths and glowing plumes, all beneath a sky that never cleared. Imagine standing by one of those ancient seas. The ground is black volcanic rock, still warm in places, cracked and veined with steam. The air shimmers with heat and chemical haze. You hear no birds, no insects, only the deep rumble of the planet itself, the hiss of gas escaping from fissures, the slow roll of waves thick with iron and silt. Each droplet that splashes carries with it a trace of sulfur, carbon, and methane, the breath of a young, restless world. The sunlight above is dim and filtered through layers of haze. The sky might glow orange in the day and fade to a dull violet at dusk. Stars would be faint, their light scattered by the dense air, but the moon, much closer then, would loom large, pulling tides across an ocean that smelled of metal and smoke. It was an atmosphere built, not for comfort, but for chemistry. Methane and carbon dioxide kept the planet warm despite a fainter sun. Without those greenhouse gases, the Earth might have frozen solid. Instead, it stayed just warm enough for liquid water to persist. This delicate balance, poisonous to us but perfect for them, allowed early life to survive and spread. These microbes were masters of adaptation. They built their homes in films along rocks, in mats over sediments, or clustered around volcanic vents, forming colonies that glowed faintly under the dim light filtering through the surface water. To them, the world was not harsh. It was generous. Iron drifted freely through the seas, a constant supply of nutrients. Sulfur bubbled upward, offering energy to those who could use it. Hydrogen was abundant, a simple, reliable fuel. Everything they needed came from the Earth's restless chemistry. There was no need for oxygen, no need for sunlight in the way we think of it now. Life and planet existed in a quiet partnership, trading gases and minerals in a rhythm that had no sound. And above them, the air continued to change, slowly, invisibly. Volcanoes did not rest. Their plumes reached high into the sky, releasing new gases day after day, century after century. Every eruption replenished the atmosphere, replacing what was lost to space. Carbon dioxide dominated, keeping the air dense and heavy. Nitrogen, released from deep within the crust, joined the mix, thickening the blanket around the planet. Methane, produced both by geology and by life itself, added its peculiar glow. Together, these gases formed a veil that both protected and threatened. It trapped heat, allowing liquid oceans to remain, but it also created a world perpetually on the edge of chemical chaos. There was no blue in the sky, because there was no oxygen to scatter sunlight into that familiar color. Instead, the horizon was hazy and strange, perhaps ochre by day and violet by night. The sun, dimmer than it is now, hung lower and redder, a small disk blurred by haze. It provided enough warmth to keep the oceans from freezing, but not much more. Every day was tinted by the chemistry of the air. When it rained, droplets carried acids that etched the rocks, carving minerals into the sea. The land, bare of plants or soil, was a landscape of stone and steam, endlessly reshaped by eruptions and erosion. And yet, despite the violence, there was stability of a kind. The balance between carbon dioxide and methane kept temperatures within a narrow range, and that was enough. Life found equilibrium in the chaos. Those early microbes multiplied slowly but steadily, dividing in darkness, forming films that covered the ocean floor. In their microscopic world, time moved differently. A million years was just another cycle of tides and minerals. There was no sense of progress, no need for change. The planet's chemistry provided everything. It was a self-contained world, sealed in its own logic. The lack of oxygen, paradoxically, made it peaceful. Nothing rusted, nothing burned, Lightning could strike without igniting flame. Energy moved slowly, through chemistry rather than combustion. The ocean was a living laboratory where molecules met, reacted, and evolved in near silence. If you could have listened closely, you might have heard the faint hiss of gas rising from vents, the slow bubbling of methane escaping from the seafloor, the whisper of waves on volcanic rock. That was the soundscape of the early Earth, a rhythm not of life as we know it, but of life becoming possible. This was also a time of deep experimentation. The first cells were trying different strategies for survival. Some learned to feed on sulfur, combining it with hydrogen to release energy. Others turned to iron, oxidizing it in ways that built faint gradients of energy across their membranes. They didn't think, didn't plan. Chemistry did the thinking for them. Over time, those reactions became more efficient, more self-sustaining. Every new cell carried a tiny memory of the last, a molecular inheritance that would echo across billions of years. Meanwhile, the planet's crust continued to shift and churn. Supercontinents had not yet formed in their modern sense, but small landmasses drifted slowly across the molten mantle. Tectonic plates collided and pulled apart, creating chains of volcanoes and basins that filled with seawater. Each new eruption released another breath of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the air, feeding both the greenhouse effect and the microbes below. Rain fell through that thick atmosphere, acid enough to dissolve rocks, carrying minerals into the ocean. It was a world constantly recycling itself. If you could trace one of those ancient raindrops, you might see it fall from a bronze-tinted sky into a warm sea, sink past layers of microbial film, and finally touch the ocean floor, where it would react with minerals and vanish into the planet's slow metabolism. Everything was connected: air, water, stone, and life, locked in a cycle that had no beginning and no end. In that sense, the first atmosphere was not just a physical environment. It was a character in the story, alive in its own way. It breathed through volcanoes, coughed through vents, exhaled methane, and inhaled carbon from the oceans. It was thick enough to hold warmth, thin enough to let sunlight through, and unstable enough to keep chemistry dancing. From its swirling clouds to its metallic seas, the early Earth was both hostile and tender, a paradox wrapped in haze. No creature could have looked up at that sky and called it beautiful, but from a distance, it might have shimmered with strange elegance, a planet wrapped in bronze and gold, spinning slowly under a younger sun, the same Earth but not yet ours. And yet, in that suffocating air, life took its first real breath, not of oxygen but of persistence. Every microbe that split, every molecule that survived another day, was part of a fragile experiment that somehow endured. They did not know that their chemistry was temporary, that the very gases sustaining them would one day change beyond recognition. For now their world was steady. The oceans were full, the air was thick, the heat constant. The planet had found a rhythm. If you could whisper into that ancient haze and tell it what was coming, it wouldn't understand, for it was content in its own way. The air was heavy, the seas alive, the volcanoes constant. It was in its own ancient voice saying something like, "All is well, all is as it should be." And for hundreds of millions of years, it was. The world without oxygen was stable, peaceful in its toxicity, calm in its danger. It was a chemistry of balance, not yet of breath. The Earth was breathing methane, carbon dioxide, and ammonia, not knowing that one day that breath would change, and everything with it. The Great Oxidation Event. When oxygen rose, the change began quietly, as most great transformations do. No explosion, no thunder, no sudden signal in the sky. Just sunlight striking the surface of an ancient sea and waking a few microscopic architects from their chemical dreams. They were tiny, fragile, and entirely unaware of what they were about to unleash. Cyanobacteria, we call them now. The first photosynthesizers, little blue-green builders, drifting in shallow oceans, stirring light into life. They discovered a trick, one so simple and yet so revolutionary that it would rewrite the story of the planet. With nothing more than sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, they could create energy for themselves. In the process, they produced something new and invisible. Oxygen. To them, it was waste, an unwanted byproduct, a breath they didn't need. But to the Earth, it was a spark of change, so vast that it would alter everything. At first, the oxygen didn't go anywhere. It met iron dissolved in the oceans, rusting it instantly. The seas that had shimmered dark and metallic began to turn cloudy, then red, as iron oxide rust fell like snow to the ocean floor. Layer after layer of iron and silica settled, pressing into stone over millions of years. Those banded iron formations, still visible today in cliffs and quarries, are the frozen record of the planet learning to breathe. The process went on for ages, slow and relentless. Each molecule of oxygen created by those ancient microbes was instantly devoured by something else. Iron, sulfur, methane. The oceans and atmosphere were full of chemical appetites, and oxygen was their new feast. It couldn't build up, not yet. The world was too hungry, too reactive, but the cyanobacteria didn't stop. They continued their work tirelessly, basking in sunlight, multiplying, expanding across tidal flats and lagoons, spreading carpets of life that would come to shape the destiny of the entire planet. Imagine that world. Shallow seas glowing with films of living green, each cell a miniature factory, releasing gas into water that could no longer hold it all. Bubbles formed tiny and constant, rising toward the surface, bursting into the heavy air. To any observer, if one could exist, it might have seemed gentle, almost serene, but beneath that calm, chemistry was building to a tipping point. Slowly the iron ran out. The oxygen kept coming, and for the first time it began to linger. At first only traces, mere whispers of change, but even whispers can grow. The oceans began to clear, and the sky, once shrouded in haze, started to shift towards something new. It took millions of years, but eventually oxygen began to spill into the atmosphere, and that was when the world turned dangerous. For the countless anaerobic organisms, the ones that had thrived in the oxygen-free seas for over 1 billion years, this new gas was not a gift. It was a toxin. Oxygen, for all its beauty and life-giving promise, is reactive and destructive. It tears apart organic molecules, corrodes metals, and burns with ferocity given the right spark. To the life of that time, oxygen was death itself. As concentrations rose, the oceans became poisonous to the very creatures that had built them. Whole ecosystems collapsed, cell by cell, in silence. The deep waters turned hostile. Microbes that could not adapt retreated to the last pockets of anoxic refuge, deep sediments, hydrothermal vents, the underbellies of rocks. For them, the age of sunlight had become an apocalypse. It was Earth's first great catastrophe, the first mass extinction. Billions of tiny lives vanished, not in a single moment, but in a slow, drawn-out suffocation. The very air had turned against them. What had once been a stable, methane-rich world was now oxidizing, transforming, purging itself. And above the dying seas, oxygen continued to climb. If you could have seen it, the transformation would have been mesmerizing. The haze that once wrapped the planet began to thin. Methane, broken apart by oxygen, disappeared from the air. The sky for the first time turned blue. The sunlight grew sharper, clearer, painting the world with a brilliance it had never known. From space, Earth would have looked utterly reborn, but for those below, it was the end of the old world. The cyanobacteria, unknowingly, had remade their planet. They had become both creators and destroyers. Their waste gas sterilized habitats, oxidized the seas, and choked the atmosphere with a compound that none of their neighbors could tolerate. Yet for them, it was paradise. They flourished in the new chemical order they had built, spreading farther, faster, feeding on light with infinite patience. They covered the planet in layers of green, forming mats and domes and reefs that gleamed faintly under the newborn sun. Each pulse of photosynthesis added more oxygen to the air, and with it, more destruction for the old forms of life. Some microbes adapted, inventing new enzymes to detoxify oxygen or even to use it for their own energy. It was the birth of a new metabolism, a way of breathing that would one day make complex life possible. But most were not so lucky. They perished quietly, dissolved by chemistry, erased by evolution. The balance of gases shifted. Methane, once the dominant greenhouse gas, was consumed, reacting with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water vapor. The Earth's blanket thinned, and the temperature began to drop. The planet cooled under its new, clearer skies. For the first time, ice began to spread across its surface, glittering where once there had only been haze and steam. The world was learning what it meant to breathe and what it cost to do so. In a sense, the Great Oxidation Event wasn't a single moment, but a long awakening. It unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, a slow-motion revolution that changed everything without a sound. It was chemistry with consequence, proof that life and planet are inseparable, locked in feedback loops that shape each other endlessly. The cyanobacteria didn't intend to change the world. They simply followed the rules of light and survival. Yet, in doing so, they opened the door to everything that would follow: new metabolisms, new ecosystems, new futures. But at the time, it must have seemed like the end of all things. The seas that had once shimmered with microbial life now rusted under their own chemistry. The air, once thick and comfortable for its inhabitants, grew sharp and thin. The world's first apocalypse came not from an asteroid or a volcanic winter, but from life itself, tiny, unthinking cells that had stumbled upon a way to harvest sunlight. It's a strange kind of poetry, isn't it? That the same process that fills your lungs tonight once nearly emptied the oceans of life. Every breath you take is a continuation of that story, a story of unintended creation, of evolution written in oxidation. If you could listen to the earth in that ancient age, perhaps you would hear the faint hum of change, the quiet bubbling of oxygen rising through the sea, the soft hiss of rust forming on the ocean floor, the distant sigh of methane fading from the sky. It was not a violent sound, but a persistent one, the heartbeat of transformation. Over time, the survivors adapted. Some microbes found ways to hide from oxygen deep underground or beneath layers of sediment. Others embraced it, developing protective molecules and enzymes that neutralized its dangers. A few even discovered how to use it, turning a toxin into power. Aerobic respiration was born, a far more efficient way to extract energy from food. From that innovation, every future animal, every leaf, every human breath would eventually arise. But that came much later. For now, the planet was in flux. The oceans rusted and cleared. The air sharpened. The blue of the sky deepened. The Earth's chemistry had crossed a threshold it could never return from. The age of anoxia, the long oxygen-free dream, was over. And yet, if you could hover above the planet then, it would have looked almost peaceful. Vast seas glinting under a pale sun, continents low and barren, streaked with iron, the air calm, the light clean. You would never guess that beneath that stillness lay the memory of extinction, that the clarity of the sky was born from the death of worlds unseen. That is the paradox of the Great Oxidation Event. Creation and destruction woven into one breath. It was the planet's first act of self-renewal, a transformation so complete that it redefined what life could be. Oxygen, once a poison, would become the foundation of future vitality. But in that moment it was still a weapon, a silent gas, spreading through water and air, undoing billions of years of stability. And as the last of the old microbes faded, the new Earth took its first long, clean inhale. The haze lifted, the oceans glowed, the planet had changed forever. The cyanobacteria, drifting still in their shallow seas, had no idea what they had done. They could not sense the extinction, nor imagine the future. They simply basked in the light, dividing, multiplying, doing what life always does, persist. But in their quiet persistence, they had rewritten the chemistry of the cosmos itself. Oxygen had arrived. The air was no longer the same. The Great Oxidation Event was over, but its consequences had only begun. The Earth had survived its first catastrophe, and from that chaos, the stage was set for everything that would follow. The aftermath, the first mass extinction. The silence came first. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a storm, but the silence of something deeper, emptier, the hush that settles when the world itself changes its breath. Oxygen had arrived, and with it came collapse. What had once been a stable, thriving planet of invisible life was now unraveling molecule by molecule. For billions of years, Earth had known only one kind of living chemistry, life that thrived in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic life, we call it now. Simple, ancient organisms that found comfort in darkness, that fed on sulfur and iron, that breathed in ways so different from ours that we can barely imagine them. To those early forms, oxygen was not life, it was poison, and when it spread, it did not come gently. Imagine the oceans first, vast and dark and full of unseen motion. In those waters, microbial communities had lived unchallenged for ages, passing energy along chemical chains as steady as tides. Iron and sulfur flowed through them like currency, each reaction feeding the next. But then, slowly, that invisible gas began to seep in. It dissolved into the upper layers of the sea, met the iron drifting freely there, and changed it. The ocean began to rust. Iron, once the foundation of so many metabolisms, suddenly turned useless, bound into solid oxides that sank out of reach. The color of the water shifted from greenish metal hues to deep red browns, as if the sea itself had begun to bleed. Layer after layer of that rust settled on the seafloor, burying the history of a dying world in bands of iron that would one day become the bones of mountains. The banded iron formations, the ancient scars of that age, still sleep in the crust today, silent witnesses to the first global crisis. For the microbes floating near the surface, oxygen's touch was lethal. Their enzymes, evolved for an oxygen-free world, broke apart in its presence, their cell walls oxidized, their chemistry unraveled. They suffocated not for lack of air, but because the new air burned them from within. Billions perished, entire species disappearing without a trace. The balance that had held the biosphere steady for so long was gone. The great food webs of the early oceans, simple but intricate, woven from bacteria feeding on chemical gradients, collapsed. Where once there had been abundance, there was now scarcity. In the depth, the old metabolism struggled to survive, hiding from the rising tide of oxygen that filtered down like a slow storm. From above, the changes might have looked beautiful, if beauty could exist in disaster. The haze that had once choked the sky was fading. Sunlight, clearer and sharper, pierced deeper into the water, revealing the red stains spreading through the sea. The smell of sulfur, once heavy in the air, gave way to something unfamiliar and metallic. Lighting sparked differently now. Fires could catch where before they had smothered. The planet's chemistry had shifted, and with it, its soul. The Earth was no longer the same. It was oxidizing, transforming, consuming itself. In the shallow coastal regions, the effect was swift and cruel. The microbial mats that had once covered rocks like living carpets began to wither, the delicate balance of gases within them, hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, was torn apart by the encroaching oxygen. It diffused through their surfaces, reacting violently, disrupting the fragile chains of life within. To an outside observer, if one had existed, the change might have looked like a slow decay, a dulling of color, a loss of sheen, a fading of vitality. But on the microscopic scale, it was war. Molecules that had coexisted peacefully were now turning on one another. Metabolic pathways collapsed, enzymes twisted and failed, membranes tore apart. The invisible foundations of life were dissolved. The deeper oceans fared no better. As oxygen trickled downward, it met layers of methane and sulfur, triggering reactions that stripped away what little balance remained. Hydrogen sulfide bloomed, forming deadly pockets of gas that drifted upward, killing everything in their path. The once stable chemistry of the deep turned chaotic. Whole ecosystems winked out, extinguished not by predators or famine, but by the quiet violence of oxidation. The planet was cleansing itself in chemistry, and life had no defense. Above the waves, the sky itself was changing color. The first hints of blue began to emerge as the haze of methane thinned, replaced by a growing blanket of nitrogen and oxygen. Clouds formed higher, whiter, thinner. Sunlight struck the surface with new clarity, but to those who lived below, that brightness was meaningless. The oxygen that painted the sky blue had stolen their world. The air had become the enemy. There's a strange irony to it all. The gas that would someday allow animals to move, to think, to dream, began its existence as an agent of extinction. It was not yet a symbol of vitality, but of ruin. The old world, the anaerobic Earth, had been stable, calm, chemically rich, but unchanging. Oxygen shattered that stillness. It introduced instability, reactivity, energy. It was a spark that refused to go out. And as it spread, the world burned, not with flame, but with chemistry. The oceans became chemical battlegrounds. Iron oxidized, methane was stripped away, sulfur transformed into new compounds. The pH of the water shifted, nutrient cycles broke down. The vast microbial mats that had blanketed tidal flats once dense and thriving crumbled. Without their producers, the consumers vanished too. It was an ecological domino effect that touched every level of life. For the first time, extinction wasn't local or temporary, it was planetary. The Earth had lost its breath and was learning to take a new one. To imagine it now is to imagine contradiction. Beauty and horror intertwined. Red seas glinting beneath a newborn blue sky. The slow gleam of oxidized rock where once there was volcanic blackness. The air clearer, and yet deadly to almost everything that had ever lived. If you could have floated above it, watching through the thin atmosphere, you might have seen continents rusting at their edges, rivers running red, storms gathering from the heat of a planet remade. You would not have heard screams or thunder, just the quiet crackle of chemistry as oxygen met matter, and matter surrendered. In that long, silent devastation, the planet was also transforming itself in ways that would last forever. The oxidation of iron pulled vast quantities of carbon and methane from the atmosphere, cooling the world. The once warm oceans began to chill. Glaciers advanced across regions that had never known ice. The balance between warmth and cold, between breath and death, shifted with every reaction. The world was teetering between two identities, the one that had been and the one that was forming. To the surviving anaerobes, it must have felt like exile. The upper layers of the ocean were lost, toxic with oxygen. They retreated downward into sediments, vents and cracks in the rock where oxygen could not reach. The surface of the planet, the place that had once been theirs, was now alien. They became ghosts of an older era, hiding in the dark, enduring as the rest of their kind vanished. For them, the oxygenated world was a graveyard. And yet, for all its destruction, there was a kind of eerie order in the chaos. Every atom of iron that rusted, every molecule of methane that oxidized, was a step in a process of renewal. The Earth itself did not understand. It was the beginning of a feedback loop. Oxygen creating change, change creating space for more oxygen. The old equilibrium was gone, replaced by flux. The planet had entered an age of motion, of reaction, of possibility. But at the time it must have felt like endless dying. From a distance, this extinction would have looked almost peaceful. No explosions, no smoke, just a slow fading. A world turning red, then brown, then quiet. The chemical signatures of death accumulating layer by layer in stone. What we see now as patterns of iron and silica were once the remains of oceans suffocating in their own transformation. Each stripe of rock, a heartbeat that stopped millions of years ago. The banded iron formations are not just mineral, they are memory. The record of the first time life changed its planet too much. There's a haunting symmetry in that story. Life created oxygen, and oxygen destroyed life. Creation and destruction are inseparable. They move together, always. It's easy to imagine the Earth in that era as violent, but it wasn't violent in any human sense. It was inevitable. Chemistry simply followed its course. The microbes did what they had always done, used energy, multiplied, survived. The reactions that sustained them spilled over, and the planet, always sensitive, responded. No one meant for it to happen. No one could stop it. The oceans, once thick with greenish film, grew clear as the haze dissolved. But that clarity was deceptive. It was not life returning. It was life gone. The sea was still, reflective, like glass. Beneath it lay the wreckage of old ecosystems, sediments heavy with dead cells, iron oxides, and sulfur compounds. The water carried ghosts of methane and hydrogen sulfide, chemical remnants of metabolisms that no longer existed. The Earth, for the first time, had known loss, and perhaps, if you could have stood there, in the hush after the great dying, you would have felt it. The air cool and sharp, the light painfully clean, the horizon unfamiliar, the smell of metal on the wind, the sound of nothing. The planet exhaled and found itself alone. The old world had ended, not with fire but with oxidation. The first extinction was complete. It would take millions of years for the Earth to recover, to settle into its new rhythm. But in that moment, the transformation was total. The seas rusted, the sky cleared, the biosphere collapsed. And yet, from that collapse came the foundation of everything that would follow. Oxygen had remade the planet, not gently, but thoroughly. It had scoured it clean. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but potential. The Earth was waiting, stripped bare, ready for the next chapter. But the memory of that first catastrophe remained. Every rust-red rock, every glimmering band of iron, buried deep underground, still whispers the same story. There was a time when the air itself was death. Oxygen had risen, and life had fallen. The world had turned against its own creators, and in doing so, it had begun again. The first mass extinction had swept across the oceans, and from that quiet devastation, a new Earth, an oxygen Earth, was being born. Adapting to oxygen, life finds a new way. After the silence came a spark. It began in hidden corners, tiny pockets of chemistry that refused to end. In the deep sediments and dim shallows, a few survivors lingered. Microbes that had not only endured the change, but had begun slowly, curiously, to use it. Oxygen, the poison that had ended so much, became their tool. It was an accident at first, a side reaction in the flow of energy inside their cells. But what began as chance became revolution. The world had changed, and life was changing with it. Oxygen is a paradox. It kills easily, but it also unlocks immense power. When harnessed carefully, it allows organisms to extract far more energy from food than any anaerobic reaction ever could. A single molecule of glucose burned with oxygen yields many times more energy than the same molecule fermented in the dark. Energy means movement, replication, complexity. In oxygen's danger, life discovered its greatest strength. The first aerobic bacteria were born, microbes that could breathe the new air and thrive. Where others had choked, they inhaled. They were not large, not visible, not miraculous in form, but within them the chemistry of the planet shifted again. They developed enzymes that tamed oxygen's violent reactivity, catalase, peroxidase, superoxide dismutase, molecular shields that allowed them to survive in its presence. Then they learned not just to defend against it, but to use it, feeding it into their metabolism as a fuel. Oxygen, once the enemy, became the heart of their power. The same element that had burned the world now fed it anew. The first breath of true respiration had begun. Imagine that transformation in slow motion. Deep in a microbial mat, one tiny cell absorbs a molecule of oxygen, and instead of dying, feels a surge of energy. Its inner machinery hums faster. It divides more quickly, grows more robust. Its neighbors falter and vanish. But it continues multiplying into a small colony of oxygen users. Across the planet, in shallow seas and tidal flats, the same quiet miracle repeats. Evolution doesn't happen in leaps. It happens in whispers, in endless experiments. But when oxygen entered the story, those whispers became a chorus. Every breath of oxygen became a song of survival. The chemistry of life was rewriting itself. Before, energy had been drawn from sulfur and iron, from slow, inefficient reactions that yielded just enough to persist. Now, with oxygen in the mix, energy flowed freely. Cells could afford to do more, to build, to move, to communicate. Within them, organelles began to form, small compartments specializing in particular tasks. Some cells engulfed others, forming partnerships instead of meals. Mitochondria, the powerhouses of modern cells, are thought to be the descendants of those first aerobic symbionts, bacteria that once drifted alone, now living within larger hosts, sharing their gift of oxygen metabolism. It was cooperation born of catastrophe. Chemistry turned to alliance. The Earth, too, was changing in step. The air grew clearer, the light brighter. The balance of gases steadied, giving rise to predictable rhythms of day and night, light and dark. Photosynthesis continued, feeding oxygen into the atmosphere, while respiration began to complete the cycle, consuming it in turn. For the first time, the planet breathed in balance, a great inhale and exhale shared between rock, water, and life. What had once been chaos was now rhythm. The biosphere, though still microbial, had learned to dance with the air. In the oceans, new colors appeared. Pigments evolved to handle oxygen's reactive light, to shield cells from its intensity and to use its energy more efficiently. Cyanobacteria still ruled the shallows, painting the surface green, but now other microbes joined the tapestry. Purple bacteria, red and brown archaea, species that thrived in gradients of oxygen and light. The microscopic world diversified, spreading across every niche that the new atmosphere allowed. Some clung to rocks, others floated freely, others burrowed into sediments. Life, in learning to breathe, had also learned to explore. The change was not only chemical but emotional. If a planet could feel emotion, after ages of stillness and loss, the Earth seemed to stir with new vitality. Each cell that embraced oxygen contributed to a rising hum of energy. The planet's surface shimmered again with biological activity. The seas once more filled with invisible motion. The age of stasis was ending. With oxygen, life could now build faster, repair itself quicker, and tolerate environments that had once been deadly. Diversity blossomed. The world was becoming creative again. And perhaps, if one could have listened closely, the Earth might have whispered, "Breathe." It was an invitation, an opening of possibility. Oxygen, the former destroyer, had become a partner. Through respiration, organisms began to release carbon dioxide and water, feeding photosynthesis in return. The cycle closed elegantly. Light created oxygen, oxygen fed energy, energy sustained life, life gave back to the light. It was a planetary symphony, simple but perfect. As energy flowed more freely, new biological strategies emerged. Some microbes developed thicker walls and more complex shapes. Others began to form colonies, cooperating rather than competing. Communication, in a chemical sense, evolved. Signals passed between cells, coordinating movement and growth. The seeds of multicellularity were being planted in the microscopic soil of the oxygen world. The tools were simple: adhesion molecules, genetic sharing, coordinated metabolism, but the potential was vast. For the first time, life could afford to be more than single. Oxygen had made abundance possible. Energy is the currency of complexity. With more of it, cells could grow larger, store information, and specialize. Evolution began to experiment in earnest. The biosphere diversified not just in form but in function. Some bacteria evolved the ability to digest others. Some became producers, others recyclers. Ecosystems, still primitive but recognizable in principle, began to reappear. Food webs reformed, this time powered not by sulfur and iron but by sunlight and oxygen. The Earth's chemistry and biology had found harmony again, but it was a new kind, faster, brighter, more dynamic. Every innovation came at a cost, but the balance was shifting toward creation. Oxygen allowed for endurance. It made possible activity, motion, even thought in the distant future. The air, once deadly, now carried potential in every molecule. If the early anaerobes had defined life's first chapter, the aerobes were writing the second, a story not of survival alone, but of possibility. The Earth was no longer merely inhabited. It was alive with purpose. It's humbling to imagine that every breath you take echoes that ancient discovery. The process inside your own cells, where oxygen turns food into energy, is the same miracle first mastered by those tiny pioneers. The mitochondria that keep you alive are their descendants, still performing the same reactions, still whispering the same molecular language of respiration. The continuity is astonishing. From single cells in ancient seas to the beating of a human heart, the thread has never been broken. As oxygen continued to shape the world, the climate stabilized into patterns that encouraged diversity. Shallow waters teemed with new life forms, mats of bacteria building structures that caught sediment and sunlight. Stromatolites, layered towers of microbial communities, rose like coral cities from the seabed. Each layer recorded a moment in time, a rhythm of light and growth, of respiration and renewal. The Earth was recording its recovery in stone. Life had learned not just to endure oxygen, but to celebrate it. The chemistry of cells grew ever more sophisticated. DNA, the molecule of inheritance, became more stable under the new conditions, protected by evolving repair mechanisms that guarded against oxygen's mutating effects. Proteins folded more precisely, membranes became stronger, more selective. Oxygen, though reactive, had forced refinement. It demanded precision. Life became more deliberate, more elegant. What had once been raw survival was now adaptation, innovation, artistry. In this renewed world, evolution gathered momentum. The planet that had once been suffocating under its own creation now exhaled gently, rhythmically. Each morning, sunlight poured into the seas, fueling photosynthesis. Each night, respiration returned balance. The air thickened with promise. Energy circulated, invisible, yet omnipresent, linking everything that lived. The biosphere had found its breath. If you could drift above that young world, you would see oceans sparkling under a deepening blue sky, continents rimmed with microbial films, air shimmering faintly with oxygen. There would be no forests yet, no animals, no flowers, just the hum of microscopic life in every drop of water. A planet quietly inventing complexity. You might think it peaceful, but in truth it was teeming. Every molecule busy, every cell experimenting, every reaction pushing the boundaries of what life could become. And beneath that activity, a kind of preparation was underway. The abundance of oxygen laid the groundwork for future leaps. With energy to spare, cells could combine, specialize, and communicate. The leap to multicellularity was not a single event, but a long unfolding, made possible by the chemistry that once threatened to end it all. Oxygen made metabolism efficient enough to sustain larger organisms, thicker tissues, coordinated growth. The scaffolding of complexity was rising, unseen but inevitable. There's a beauty in that irony, that destruction became foundation, that catastrophe became catalyst. The oxygen that once ended a world had opened the door to another. Life had not only survived, it had learned. Adaptation had turned death into transformation. The earth had whispered, breathe, and life had answered. By now, the planet's rhythm was steady again. Photosynthesis and respiration pulsed together, keeping the air in balance. The seas sparkled with oxygen bubbles rising to the surface, each one a tiny echo of the first breath. The world was ready, though it didn't know it yet. For creatures that would move, sense, and build, complexity was coming. If you pause and take a slow breath now, feel how effortlessly your body takes in oxygen and releases it again. That ease, that quiet rhythm, is the legacy of this ancient age. It is the sound of survival, the echo of adaptation written into the chemistry of your blood. Every heartbeat is a continuation of the same story, the one where life, faced with poison, found a way to turn it into power. The world had shifted from fear to harmony. The air was no longer an enemy, but a friend. The planet, once choked in its own creation, was finally breathing freely. Life, resilient as ever, had found its voice again, and in that voice the first whispers of the future could already be heard. The changing seas, from green to red. Once upon a time the oceans were green, not the gentle turquoise of shallow reefs, not the deep navy of modern seas, but a murky metallic green thick with dissolved iron, shimmering faintly under the dim sun. It was a world that smelled of minerals and warmth, a world alive with microbes drifting in waters that never knew blue. For hundreds of millions of years, those seas had been steady, rich in chemistry, dense with invisible life. But then something new began to move through them, something invisible, reactive, and full of intention. Oxygen began to flow into the water. At first it was a whisper, just a trace of gas dissolving at the surface where sunlight touched. But even a whisper of oxygen was enough to stir the chemistry of the deep. It met the iron that filled those ancient oceans, and together they danced a chemical waltz that changed the color of the planet. Iron, once content to drift in its reduced soluble form, now found itself confronted by oxygen's appetite. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. Iron oxidized, it rusted. The oceans, once green and glossy, began to turn red. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. Layer by layer, molecule by molecule, the sea transformed. Every droplet carried its own quiet storm of reactions. Iron met oxygen met iron, and flakes of rust began to fall. tiny particles sinking through the water like dust in sunlight. Over time, those particles settled in vast thin sheets across the seafloor, mixing with layers of silica and sediment. They built stripes, iron-rich and iron-poor, alternating bands that recorded each pulse of chemistry like pages in a planetary diary. Those layers would become the banded iron formations, or biffs, striking red and silver rocks that still gleam in cliffs and quarries today. They are the fossilized fingerprints of a world learning to breathe. If you could have swum in those seas, though I wouldn't recommend it, you'd have found the experience alarming. The water would sting your skin and taste like metal. It would shimmer in shades of copper, orange, and rust, with strange rainbows of iron particles floating beneath the surface. Sunlight, scattering through the haze of suspended minerals, would paint the ocean in layers of red and gold. From above, it might look like a liquid sunset. From below, it would be dark, heavy, and full of potential. It must have been breathtaking. If you could breathe it. The green world was gone, replaced by a sea in transformation. The color shift wasn't just aesthetic, it was planetary surgery. Every flake of rust that fell to the ocean floor was a sign that oxygen was spreading, claiming space, rewriting the chemistry of the water. The microbes that had once feasted on iron in its soluble form suddenly found their food supply vanishing. The ocean was losing its old balance, becoming a laboratory for new possibilities. But let's pause for a moment and imagine the scene not as tragedy but as theatre. The Great Oxidation Event's oceans were not subtle, they were dramatic. Iron snow fell from the upper waters in crimson drifts. Volcanic vents bubbled below, pouring out minerals that immediately oxidized upon contact with oxygen, creating clouds of red-brown dust. The light filtering through it all was surreal, amber skies mirrored by copper seas. The entire planet looked as though it had been dipped in sunset. It was, in a way, the first great act of art on Earth. The planet was painting itself. Of course, not everything appreciated the makeover. The microbes that had once dominated those seas were dying in unimaginable numbers, their metabolic chemistry undone by oxygen's sharp edge. But even in death, they helped build the future. Their bodies settled with the rust, adding carbon and nutrients to the seafloor. Layer by layer, life and mineral fused, recording not only extinction but transformation. The Earth was composing, unconsciously, a kind of requiem in stone. And what stones they became. Banded iron formations are among the most beautiful geological relics on the planet. Ribbons of red hematite and grey chert, forged from the reactions of ancient seas. When you hold a piece of one, you are holding time itself, billions of years, compressed into color. Each stripe marks a rhythm, a pulse of oxygen from microbial bloom, a pause when iron ran low, a resurgence as new minerals entered the ocean. Red silver breath, heartbeat, breath. The ocean's chemistry, preserved in art. It's tempting to see those formations as scars, but they are also promises. They mark the moment when Earth began storing oxygen, not only in its air but in its very bones. Every layer of rust pulled oxygen out of the water and locked it away in rock, slowly cleansing the ocean and clearing the stage for something new. When the last of the dissolved iron was gone, the seas could finally begin to hold free oxygen, and with it, a new kind of life could begin to emerge. But that was still far ahead. For now, the ocean was red, restless, and full of contradictions, both deadly and fertile, destructive and creative all at once. You could almost imagine the planet chuckling at its own audacity. "I said I'd change," Earth might have whispered, "but I didn't say it would be subtle." The seas, once green with iron and sulfur, had turned a deep ochre, their surface sparkling with bubbles of oxygen rising toward a sky not yet ready to handle them. The contrast was stark. Above, a dim sun shining through thinning haze, below, a riot of chemical reactions, painting the world anew. It was chaos, yes, but the kind that gives birth to pattern. And within that chaos, chemistry began to whisper its next idea. As iron settled out of the water, other reactions took its place. New minerals formed, new nutrients circulated, and oxygen's presence began to shape the evolution of every surviving microbe. For the first time, the ocean had layers defined not just by temperature or depth, but by chemistry. The upper waters, rich with oxygen, sparkled with light and potential. The deeper layers, starved of it, remained ancient and anaerobic, a reminder of the world that once was. Between them, gradients formed, zones where life could experiment, adapt, and explore. The oceans had become arenas for evolution. If we could dip a camera into that world, it might seem alien. Sunlight would scatter through particles of rust, creating halos of red light that faded into darkness. The water would pulse with faint bioluminescence from surviving microbes, green and purple against the copper glow. Strange mats of bacteria would cling to rocks, their pigments adjusting to the new light and chemistry, shifting colors like slow-motion auroras. It was a harsh place, acidic, reactive, unbreathable, but also astonishingly alive in its resilience. The ocean floor was thickening with sediment, the slow snowfall of iron oxides and organic remains. In places, it formed smooth plains, in others, rippled dunes of red dust. Each layer recorded the balance between oxygen production and iron availability. When oxygen surged, rust bloomed. When it waned, grey silica returned. The pattern repeated for millions of years, a rhythm that echoed across the planet. The oceans were not dying. They were transforming, composing the mineral foundations of continents and mountain ranges yet to come. Even the volcanic activity that once fed the seas with iron was changing. The chemistry of eruptions began to shift under the influence of the new oxidizing environment. Lava that once bubbled black now cooled in shades of crimson and brown. Minerals that had never existed before, hematite, magnetite, goethite, appeared, each one a product of oxygen's relentless creativity. The planet's palette had expanded. Earth was no longer grey and green. It was red, gold, and alive. There's a strange humor in that, how the world, in trying to kill its first inhabitants, accidentally made itself beautiful. The same rust that spelled doom for ancient microbes now glitters in gemstones, colors landscapes, and gives Mars its hue. Iron, once the heartbeat of the early oceans, became the pigment of planets. The chemistry of catastrophe became the color of wonder. Earth, in learning to breathe, had also learned to paint. As the ocean's transformation continued, the water cleared. The red haze began to settle out, leaving behind transparency unknown in earlier ages. For the first time, sunlight penetrated deeply, illuminating the sea from surface to floor. Photosynthesis could now reach new depths, fueling more production, more oxygen, more change. The feedback loop accelerated. The green world was gone, the red world fading, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a blue world waited to be born. Yet in that in-between state, when the water was neither fully red nor fully clear, there was an odd beauty, an earth caught mid-transformation. The surface shimmered like a sheet of copper, the deeper layers gleamed with faint emerald, and above it all, a dim sun cast soft golden light. The planet looked alive in a new way, volatile, dynamic, expressive. The oceans had become mirrors reflecting both life and death, endings and beginnings, in a single swirling body of water. If you were to stand at the edge of that ocean and listen, perhaps you would hear a faint fizzing sound, the whisper of bubbles rising through iron-laden waves. Each one was a breath of oxygen escaping into the air, a tiny announcement of change. Together, they formed a chorus, a planet exhaling for the first time. Look, the earth might have said, I am learning to breathe. And somewhere in that rust-colored water, new organisms were waiting. Tiny, invisible, already experimenting with what oxygen could offer. The seas that had killed so much were also nurturing the beginnings of something greater. The red oceans, harsh as they were not endings at all. They were thresholds. The iron that rained down to the seafloor was not waste. It was the foundation of continents. The chemistry that had caused devastation was at the same time setting the stage for evolution. In time, the red would fade, the oxygen would rise higher, the iron would be locked away, and the oceans would take on their modern blue, a color born not of peace, but of change. But for millions of years, Earth wore its rust proudly. The oceans glowed like molten metal under the young sun, and the planet, newly awake, seemed to revel in its own transformation. So if you ever find yourself by the edge of the sea, watching the water shift between greens and reds in the light of dawn or dusk, remember that you're seeing an echo of that ancient story. The sea has always been an artist, and once, long ago, it painted itself in iron. It was harsh, it was chaotic, but it was necessary. The green oceans became red, and from red came the first hint of blue. The planet, in its quiet wisdom, had whispered, "Color me alive," and the oceans obeyed. The new sky, oxygen shapes the world. The transformation of the sky was not sudden, but it was profound. For billions of years, Earth's atmosphere had been a swirling haze of volcanic gases, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, a veil that dimmed the sunlight and painted the heavens in tones of copper and violet. But now, after ages of quiet chemical warfare between oxygen and stone, the air was changing. Slowly, invisibly, the sky itself began to clear. The planet was breathing in a new rhythm, and for the first time in its long history, it could see its own color. Oxygen was rising, not yet to the abundance we know today, but enough to matter, enough to turn the tide. From less than a trace, it climbed toward 2, then 5, then perhaps 10% of the modern atmosphere's level. It doesn't sound like much, but it was revolutionary. The old haze of methane broke apart under oxygen's relentless chemistry, scattering into carbon dioxide and water vapor. The greenhouse shroud that had once held the world in its warm embrace began to thin, and through it sunlight poured unfiltered and unbroken. The sky was turning blue. The air, once heavy and opaque, became transparent. For the first time, light traveled freely from one horizon to another. The world could see itself, and the heavens could see the world. With that light came danger. The sun, generous and unforgiving, bathed the planet in radiation. High-energy ultraviolet waves that split molecules and burned fragile organic matter. Before, the methane haze had shielded the surface from much of that assault. But now, with that haze dissolving, the young, thin atmosphere was exposed. Life, still mostly hidden in water or beneath rock, could not yet walk under that brilliance unscathed. The sunlight was pure, too pure, its beauty edged with peril. The planet needed a guardian, and once again, oxygen answered. High above the surface, in the cold, thin reaches of the upper atmosphere, oxygen molecules began to dance with sunlight. Ultraviolet rays struck them, splitting them apart into single atoms, which then collided with other oxygen molecules to form something new. Ozone. 3 atoms bound together into a single rare molecule. O3. It was fragile, reactive, and perfect. For the first time, Earth began to grow a shield, a layer of ozone that stretched like an invisible canopy over the planet, catching ultraviolet light before it could strike the surface. It was the atmosphere's first act of grace, the moment when air learned to protect rather than destroy. It's hard to overstate what that meant. The ozone layer turned chaos into stability. With it, sunlight softened. The upper air warmed just enough to create a temperature gradient that stabilized weather, allowing winds and clouds to form predictable patterns. The sky found balance. The new atmosphere was not only transparent but structured, a living system, layered and dynamic. It was no longer just a mix of gases, it was a mechanism, an engine, a protector. The air had learned to keep its own secret. If you could have stood beneath that newborn sky, though no creature yet could, you might have been struck by its brilliance. Gone were the heavy purples and burnt oranges of the methane haze. The horizon now curved in a pale sapphire arc. The sunlight, no longer filtered through dust and chemistry, gleamed pure white, scattering blue photons across the air. Clouds gathered and drifted in patterns familiar to us now, billowing with moisture, lit from above. The world had acquired clarity, and in that clarity, the promise of the future. Oxygen was not evenly spread, not yet. Near the ground, it collected in pockets, rising and falling with the rhythm of microbial photosynthesis. But over time, the cycles grew steadier. Every breath of oxygen released into the air by photosynthetic life was balanced by chemical reactions in the rocks and oceans that absorbed the excess. A new equilibrium emerged, not perfect, but sustainable. For the first time, the planet's surface chemistry and its atmosphere began to move in harmony. The air became self-regulating, a living mirror of the biosphere below. The physics of the atmosphere itself was transformed. With oxygen present, combustion became possible. Lightning could spark fire, heat could drive reaction, Chemistry could accelerate. The surface grew more dynamic, more restless. Weather systems gained new complexity. Clouds reflected sunlight, cooling the planet, while the ozone layer above kept ultraviolet radiation at bay. The dance of balance had begun, a delicate choreography between light, air, and life. The Earth was no longer a passive receiver of sunlight, it was participating. In those early oxygen-rich centuries, the atmosphere might have smelled faintly metallic, sharp with ozone and nitrogen oxides. The air, though breathable to no creature yet, carried a charge, a crispness born of energy. The blue sky above was a promise. The darkness of space beyond, a mystery. The sun's rays struck the ozone layer and scattered harmlessly, creating a faint shimmer of ultraviolet light that glowed unseen to the naked eye. High above, auroras may have flickered as solar particles met the newborn magnetic field and danced across the poles. The Earth was learning to be luminous. That ozone shield was more than a chemical accident. It was a hinge in history. Before it, life could not endure the sun's unfiltered fury on land. After it, the door to the continents began, slowly to open. The air above the water, once deadly, was now guarded. The world had space to grow, to imagine, to climb. Billions of years would pass before that invitation was accepted, before moss and fern and animal would crawl from sea to shore. But the foundation was set. The atmosphere was ready long before the travelers who would breathe it. From the planet's edge, the change must have been astonishing. A once dull, orange-brown sphere now gleamed blue and white against the dark. The new atmosphere scattered sunlight like a prism, turning the planet into a jewel. To distant eyes, had there been any, it would have looked alive. The oxygen that had poisoned one world was now making another radiant. The planet had found its color. The chemistry of the air was elegant in its simplicity. Nitrogen still reigned as the dominant gas, inert and reliable. Carbon dioxide lingered in smaller amounts, just enough to keep warmth near the surface. Argon drifted quietly, indifferent to change, and then oxygen, just a few percent, but enough to define everything, enough to drive combustion, erosion, respiration, enough to light the stars of the living world that would one day follow. The air had become an engine of potential, a stage set for drama still billions of years away. This new balance also gave birth to pressure and weather as we understand them. Winds began to shape the surface, carrying moisture from sea to land. Raindrops formed more easily, guided by charged particles in the oxygen-rich air. Storms gained structure, powered by temperature contrast stabilized by ozone. Lightning cracked, igniting the chemistry of the ground, fusing elements, forming nitrates and amino acids anew. Every storm became a small act of creation. The sky was not just background, it was alive, moving, sculpting the world below. The presence of oxygen also meant that the atmosphere could interact with sunlight in more complex ways. Infrared radiation was trapped and released in cycles, helping maintain temperatures suitable for liquid water. The planet's energy balance, once precarious, became resilient, even when volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts disturbed it. The ozone layer absorbed radiation, the clouds cooled the surface, and life beneath the waves continued. The new sky was not fragile. It was forgiving. It could heal itself, adjust, recover. Earth had become a self-correcting system. There's something almost poetic about that. How chaos creates resilience. How destruction builds strength. The air that had once killed became the atmosphere that made life possible. The violence of oxidation gave rise to the calm of blue. The planet had not only survived the oxygen revolution, it had been reborn by it. Oxygen was no longer a threat, but a sculptor, shaping climate, chemistry, and light into harmony. If you could watch a sunrise then, with the ozone freshly woven into the sky, it would have been unlike any seen before. The horizon would blaze with pinks and golds, scattering through the new clarity. The air, rich with scattering particles, would glow even after the sun had risen, painting the world in color that never existed before. Shadows would stretch longer, clouds would gleam brighter. The planet had found its door. Over time, oxygen's presence stabilized. The air became a blend of balance and brilliance, a mix tuned perfectly to support what was yet to come. With the ozone layer guarding the upper atmosphere and the magnetic field deflecting cosmic rays, the surface grew quieter, calmer, radiation levels fell, the sky's once lethal light softened into warmth. The stage was set, though the actors had not yet arrived. The continents were still barren, the land ungreened, but the air above them waited, patient, ready to cradle breath. In a way, this was the moment when Earth became truly habitable. Not because it had life, but because it could keep it. The atmosphere had matured, evolving from a veil of survival into a system of protection. The ozone layer, thin and fragile though it was, represented an extraordinary collaboration between physics, chemistry, and biology. It was not merely a shield, it was a bridge, connecting the living and the cosmic, the sea and the sky. And as the atmosphere settled into this new equilibrium, it carried a kind of serenity. The planet's colors deepened, the sunlight, refracted through oxygen and ozone, turned the world luminous. Even in the absence of complex life, there was a sense of expectation in the air, as if the planet knew something was coming. The conditions were right. The shield was in place. The air was waiting to be breathed. If the Earth could have spoken then, perhaps it would have said, "At last." The long battle of chemistry was over. The fires of creation had burned through catastrophe and emerged as balance. The atmosphere was no longer an accident. It was a masterpiece, a thin film of gases that could cradle oceans, sculpt weather, and protect the fragile spark of life. Oxygen had become not the destroyer, but the caretaker. And so, under a newly blue sky, the planet turned on its axis, bathed in sunlight that no longer burned, but nourished. The air shimmered with possibility. The ozone layer stood silent and strong, catching the sun's most dangerous rays and scattering them harmlessly into light. From space, the world glowed, blue, white, and alive with promise. The atmosphere, born of fire and transformation, had found its peace. It was the first time Earth could truly say, "It is safe now." The great experiment of life would continue, stronger and more daring than before. The new sky had learned its purpose, not to hide, not to harm, but to protect. The Earth, for the first time, was ready for the future. The new life, the evolutionary turning point, it began in silence, as most revolutions do, not with thunder or chaos, but with a quiet change deep inside the smallest of things. In the wake of oxygen's rise, the world was unrecognizable. The ancient chemistries that had once ruled the seas had fallen still, replaced by something far more potent, far more daring. Oxygen, the restless element that had once been a poison, now shimmered through the water and air, a source of boundless energy waiting to be harnessed. And somewhere, in the invisible depths, a cell discovered. The first aerobic organisms, the oxygen breathers, were the heirs of catastrophe. They had learned the art of survival in a new and dangerous world, and with that art came power. Oxygen, when mastered, could yield extraordinary energy. Every breath, every reaction released a torrent of usable force. A single molecule of glucose, burned with oxygen, produced more than a dozen times the energy it once had. For the first time, life could afford extravagance. It could build more, move faster, grow larger. That moment, the union of oxygen and life, was the great pivot on which evolution would turn forever. Imagine a microbe floating in that ancient ocean, surrounded by currents rich in this strange new gas. Inside its membrane, enzymes, molecular machines, begin to take advantage of oxygen's volatility, channeling its power into delicate chains of reactions. Instead of dying from oxidation, this cell thrives on it, learning to breathe chemistry's fire. It is a tiny thing, no larger than a dust mote, but in that small act, it becomes the ancestor of everything complex that would ever live. This is the first step from simplicity toward wonder. From these early aerobic cells came the seeds of complexity. With so much energy at their disposal, some began to change in form and function. They grew larger, storing oxygen and nutrients. They developed internal membranes to separate the chaos of chemistry into order, compartments for respiration, for digestion, for thought. Life was inventing architecture. These were not yet animals or plants or anything that could be seen with the naked eye. but they were different. They were eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, with structure, with imagination written into their chemistry. It was a breathtaking innovation, one that would rewrite the planet. The creation of the eukaryotic cell was more than a new branch on the tree of life. It was the birth of the tree itself, a leap in design that allowed for collaboration, coordination, and diversity. Each cell carried within it a tiny memory of the catastrophe that had come before. Inside their cytoplasm lived the descendants of those first aerobic bacteria, mitochondria, ancient symbionts that once drifted alone. They had been engulfed, not destroyed, and now they lived as part of something larger, converting oxygen into energy for their host. Two lives had merged into one, and from that union came the energy of worlds. This partnership, primitive, improbable, perfect, was the foundation for all higher life. With mitochondria came efficiency. With efficiency came growth. With growth came imagination. Cells began to specialize, to divide their labor to form colonies where each played a different role. The boundaries between individuals blurred. What had once been many became one. Multicellularity, the great experiment, had begun. At first it was humble, filaments of cells linked together, thin sheets of tissue clinging to rocks or drifting in the currents. But even that was revolutionary. Each cluster could communicate, share resources, and survive in ways that single cells could not. Some cells became feeders, others builders, others protectors. Together they could shape their own microenvironments, altering flow and light, building mats, towers, and spheres. In these tiny worlds, cooperation became evolution's most powerful tool. The ocean, still red and metallic in places, became a playground of possibility. The new oxygen breathers spread across its depths, colonizing every niche, experimenting with every form. Some evolved whip-like tails to move through the water. Some developed shells to protect themselves. Some simply divided endlessly, building networks like living fabrics. The energy oxygen provided made all of it possible. It was like discovering fire, a fire that burned not outside but within. And while the seas shimmered with this hidden energy, the planet's evolutionary tempo quickened. Mutations that once took eons to matter now found rapid expression. Natural selection gained new tools, sculpting forms that could sense, respond, adapt. Life had gained a new kind of agility. No longer bound by the slow chemistry of fermentation, cells could evolve with speed and precision. For the first time, evolution had momentum. Oxygen gave life not only power, but endurance. With it, cells could survive longer, repair themselves better, and store more energy for the unexpected. The Earth, which had once been home to simple static forms, was becoming dynamic. A billion years of silence was breaking into motion. You could almost imagine the planet stirring, stretching, whispering to itself. Now let's see what I can do. From these quiet beginnings, diversity blossomed. The seas filled with invisible empires of microbes, some solitary, some communal, some already toying with forms that would one day resemble the organs and tissues of complex beings. The chemistry of cooperation was evolving. Cells learned to recognize one another, to exchange signals, to work in harmony. It was as if the planet itself was learning the language of community, molecule by molecule. The first multicellular organisms were soft, delicate, and brief. They left no bones, no shells, no fossils, only faint impressions in ancient stone. But their presence changed everything. They consumed more, produced more, influenced their surroundings in ways that rippled through the entire biosphere. The balance of oxygen, carbon, and nutrients shifted once again, but this time it created stability rather than collapse. The biosphere had become resilient, energy flowed in cycles. Photosynthesis, creating oxygen, respiration, consuming it, each feeding the other in perfect rhythm. And in that rhythm, beauty emerged. The oceans grew brighter as light penetrated deeper. Pigments evolved, greens, blues, purples, to harvest sunlight more efficiently. Color began to matter. Shape began to matter. For the first time, life was not merely surviving. It was exploring. The cells that had once existed only as chemistry were now artists, sculptors, and engineers in microscopic form. Every structure, Every adaptation was a brushstroke in the great painting of evolution. If you could dive into those ancient waters, you would see nothing familiar. No fish, no plants, no coral, but you would sense the energy, the motion, the quiet ambition of life. Under the microscope of time, you would see 1,000 experiments unfolding, cells clustering, splitting, merging, testing. You would see the beginnings of tissues, of communication, of coordinated movement. You would see potential awakening. You would see the dawn before the dawn. It was in this age that the lineage of all complex beings began to take shape. The ancestors of animals, plants, fungi, all trace their roots to this moment, when oxygen met imagination. Without that union, there would be no forests, no wings, no music, no thought. Everything that breathes owes its existence to this evolutionary pivot. When life looked at oxygen, the gas that once spelled death, and said, "I can use that." There's something almost mythic about it, a story written in atoms and time. The Great Oxidation Event was not just a change in chemistry, it was a change in destiny. It gave the planet a new kind of potential, one that would echo through every heartbeat and every breath to come. From that single shift from poison to power came everything that makes the modern world alive. Oxygen was no longer merely a molecule, it was a medium for complexity, the invisible architecture of existence. The first multicellular organisms were the architects of tomorrow. They were soft-bodied colonies that drifted through the ocean like living silk, each movement coordinated, each cell playing its part. Some could sense light and move toward it. Others fed collectively, digesting nutrients in shared spaces. For the first time, behavior began to matter. The line between environment and organism blurred. Life was no longer a collection of parts reacting to chemistry. It was becoming a system, an idea. The leap from single cells to multicellular creatures was as profound as the leap from ocean to land would be billions of years later. It was not a single event, but a slow unfolding, guided by chance and persistence. The ability to use oxygen efficiently allowed cells to sustain complex operations, to divide labor, to build structure, to think. In the simplest sense of the word, it was evolution's greatest invention, cooperation powered by brain. And from that invention came everything else. The roots of nervous systems, immune systems, and circulation, each would emerge from this foundation. The blueprint of the future was written here in microscopic collaborations, illuminated by oxygen. It's humbling to think that the same molecule that feeds your lungs once fueled this first dance of cells, that your every exhale is a continuation of that ancient song. The Earth was ready for complexity now. The stage had been set, oceans full of nutrients, a stable climate, and air rich enough to sustain energy-intensive life. The quiet work of billions of years had led to this, the threshold between simplicity and imagination. Life was no longer a passenger on Earth's chemistry. It was a partner, shaping the planet as much as it was shaped by it. Oxygen had made that partnership possible. If the planet had a voice, perhaps it would have murmured in delight, "Grow and be bold," and life obeyed. It stretched its membranes, multiplied its nuclei, spun new forms from old molecules. It learned to breathe, to move, to sense. It discovered the pleasure of existing with purpose. From single cells came colonies. From colonies came creatures. The line between survival and art began to blur. The Great Oxidation Event had been a trial by fire, but it left behind a world alive with possibility. The survivors had become innovators. They had turned adversity into evolution, transforming death into abundance. The ocean that once ran red with iron now shimmered with the pulse of respiration. The air that once burned was now the breath of vitality. The planet was humming again, an orchestra of oxygen and life, each feeding the other in a timeless duet. And so, the story turned. The catastrophe that had almost ended life became the reason it flourished. From oxygen's flame came the spark of complexity. From complexity came diversity. And from diversity came everything that would one day look up at the sky and wonder how it all began. The Earth, patient and persistent, had whispered, "Be more," and life had listened. The cells, small and unseen, had answered with evolution's boldest declaration, "We will become infinite." The new ecosystem, the reborn web of life. The world after oxygen's rise was not just alive, It was awake. The chaos of chemistry had given way to a fragile order, and that order began to pulse with rhythm. The seas that had once turned red with rust now shimmered with transparency and light. The air was clearer, the energy stronger, and life patient, clever life, was weaving itself back together. In the silence after catastrophe, new voices began to murmur. They were microbial, invisible, yet tireless. They were builders of balance, architects of the first true ecosystems. It began as always in the sea. The oxygen that once burned was now being used, consumed, cycled, and transformed by the new wave of organisms that had learned to breathe it. Aerobic bacteria, masters of the new chemistry, found themselves at the base of a renewed food web. They captured energy through respiration, broke down organic matter, and turned waste into nutrients once again. These small, unseen engineers became the foundation upon which everything else would depend. Each breath they took, each molecule they recycled, restored the equilibrium that the Great Oxidation Event had shattered. The planet was learning to feed itself anew. In the upper waters, sunlight still ruled. Cyanobacteria, the ancient oxygen makers, continued their quiet work, drifting in endless blooms that painted the surface green. They were the world's first producers, the architects of photosynthesis, crafting sugars from sunlight, carbon dioxide and water. Beneath them swam a growing host of consumers, protozoa and other primitive eukaryotes, newly evolved to feast upon the bacteria that filled the sea. For every cell that made, another now consumed. The loop was closing, the cycle reborn. Imagine those early oceans as vast, glowing fields of life. The surface shimmered with thin veils of microbial mats, each layer alive with purpose. Above, cyanobacteria drank the light. Below, heterotrophs fed upon their remains. It was a slow, chemical ballet, production and decay, growth and dissolution, endlessly repeated. For the first time, the flow of energy moved in patterns, cascading from one organism to another, from light to life to decomposition. It was the birth of ecology, the moment when living things stopped existing alone and began existing together. Everywhere, connections formed. When one species bloomed too abundantly, another rose to consume it. When waste accumulated, bacteria evolved to break it down, returning the nutrients to circulation. The sea became a living network of cooperation and control, an elegant choreography of balance. The new oxygen-driven world was no longer just a place for survival. It was a stage for relationship. Down in the darker waters where sunlight could not reach, a different community thrived. Anaerobes still clung to life there, protected from oxygen's sting, while new kinds of microbes evolved to bridge the gap between the light and the dark. Some could use both oxygen and sulfur, switching their metabolisms as the environment shifted. They became the intermediaries, the diplomats of the biosphere, linking ancient ways of life to the new. Even as oxygen spread, the memory of the old world lingered in these shadows, ensuring that no part of Earth's chemistry was wasted. Every niche was occupied, every pathway explored. From above, the ocean must have looked tranquil, smooth, endless, blue, but beneath its surface it was buzzing with invisible negotiation. Each reaction, each exchange of molecules, each breath of oxygen or exhalation of carbon dioxide was part of a dialogue that bound the entire planet together. For the first time, life was not scattered fragments, but a network, a pulse of interdependence stretching from pole to pole. This network expanded not only across space but also through time. As organisms lived, died, and decayed, their remains sank to the seafloor, carrying with them carbon, iron, and other nutrients. Over generations, these sediments became a living archive, storing the history of the biosphere and releasing it slowly back into the cycle. The deep ocean was no longer a graveyard. It was a reservoir, a womb of regeneration. Every death fed a new beginning. Life had discovered the secret of sustainability, that nothing need ever be wasted. The atmosphere, too, played its part in this exchange. Winds carried dust and minerals from land into the sea, while waves cast organic molecules upward into the air, releasing aerosols that seeded clouds. The boundary between ocean and sky was no longer a barrier, but a conversation. And though the land was still barren, its bare rock was being slowly carved by weather, leaching nutrients into rivers that flowed back into the ocean. The planet was connecting its systems, air, water, stone, and life, in ways it never had before. And in that connection, complexity flourished. The microbial food webs grew denser, more intricate. Producers fed consumers, consumers fed decomposers, and decomposers fed the world again. Chemical cycles that had once been simple became symphonic. Nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and carbon all moved through the web in continuous motion. Oxygen no longer sat as a destructive force. It was the conductor of this grand orchestra, driving reactions that made the entire system sing. The biosphere had become a living machine, self-regulating, self-healing, and endlessly inventive. The new ecosystem was more than chemistry. It was resilience made visible. Each species, though microscopic, carried a role that sustained the others. Remove one, and the system shifted, adapted, found balance again. The planet had learned the art of equilibrium. For the first time, stability did not mean stillness. It meant flow. Life and death became two sides of the same process. Creation and decay perfectly intertwined. The old world had known stagnation. The new world knew motion. In this renewed sea, even individuality began to blur. Microbes formed communities so tightly knit that they acted as single entities, sharing genes and metabolites like common currency. They were early examples of cooperation on a planetary scale, an anticipation of the symbioses that would one day create plants, animals, and fungi. The ocean was alive not only with organisms, but with partnerships. It was as if the planet itself had whispered, "Connect," and life had obeyed. Above the waves, that whisper carried farther than anyone or anything could yet imagine. Winds swept across the oceans, filled with oxygen and life's breath. When those winds met the land, they began to change it. Oxidation transformed the rocks, freeing nutrients trapped within. Iron rusted, manganese turned purple. Sulfur bound with oxygen to form new compounds. Rain fell, carrying those minerals back into the sea. The Earth's crust and its biosphere were now part of the same conversation. Land and ocean, chemistry and biology were partners in a single story. The balance of oxygen and carbon grew more intricate. With each generation, during the day, photosynthetic organisms filled the world with oxygen. At night, respiration returned carbon dioxide to the air. The cycle became steady, predictable, and rhythmic. The planet had learned to breathe. Each sunrise brought a gentle exhale of energy. Each sunset a quiet interlation of renewal. The daily dance of gases linked everything that lived, from the smallest bacterium to the forming continents above. It was a time of invisible abundance. The seas teemed with microscopic life, more numerous than the stars. Each droplet of water contained its own universe of interactions, a web of feeding, decomposing, and rebirth. If one could magnify that ancient ocean, it would look like a galaxy of motion shimmering with particles of life, each glowing faintly with metabolic light. It was both humble and magnificent, a reminder that ecosystems begin not with grandeur, but with patience, and patience paid off. The steady cycling of nutrients, powered by oxygen and sunlight, created layers of sediment rich in organic matter. These became the foundations of future soils, the beds of future continents, the resources of future worlds. The new ecosystem was not just sustaining the present, it was investing in the future. It was quietly building the scaffolding for forests, for coral reefs, for every network of life that would follow. Every molecule exchanged in those early waters was a promise written in chemistry that complexity would return and flourish. There was harmony now, but it was not without tension. Too much oxygen, and the system risked combustion. Too little, and the cycle would collapse. Yet the biosphere managed its balance with astonishing grace. Oxygen levels rose and fell with the tides of productivity, keeping the planet stable. Life had become both participant and regulator, creating the conditions for its own continuation. The Earth was, for the first time, alive as a system, a single breathing organism. If you stood on the edge of one of those ancient shorelines, though there were no trees or grasses yet, only rock and tide, you might have felt the vitality in the air. The ocean before you would glitter with the sheen of microbial life. You could almost hear it, the soft fizz of photosynthesis at the surface, the whisper of respiration below. The wind would carry the faint metallic tang of oxygen, the breath of a world renewing itself. Everything was in motion, everything connected, everything alive with purpose. In that quiet hum of exchange, the blueprint for all future ecosystems was written. Producers, consumers, decomposers, roles that still define life today, found their place in the order of things. Each link in the chain was fragile, yet together they formed something unbreakable. The web of life had reassembled, stronger than before, more complex than it had ever been. And though it was still microscopic, the pattern it created would one day echo in rainforests and coral reefs, in tundras and jungles, in every living system that ever emerged. This was the dawn of ecology, not just life, but relationship. Every organism depended on another, and through that dependence, the planet found stability. Oxygen powered it, sunlight sustained it, and chemistry connected it. The Earth had reinvented itself as a network of cycles, a symphony of balance that would play for billions of years to come. If you listen closely, you can still hear that music today, in the breath of the wind through leaves, in the crash of waves, in your own heartbeat. It's the same rhythm that began here, in the ancient sea, when oxygen turned poison into potential and life responded with connection. The earth, perhaps, whispered then, "Stay together," and life, learning at last the secret of endurance, answered softly, "We." The geological memory, banded iron formations, deep beneath our feet, where the weight of eons has pressed time into stone, there are layers that shimmer faintly in red and silver. They lie folded into mountains buried in ancient crusts, or cut open by rivers that carve through history itself. When sunlight strikes their surfaces, they gleam with a quiet fire, bands of crimson iron and pale quartz alternating like breaths, like heartbeats. These are the banded iron formations, the silent storytellers of Earth's greatest transformation. They are not merely rocks, they are the memory of a world that learned to breathe. Each stripe of red in these formations is a signature of oxygen, the trace of a reaction that changed everything. Billions of years ago, before mountains rose or forests grew, the oceans were thick with dissolved iron, their waters a metallic green haze. There was no oxygen then, no rust, no color of blood. The world was young, raw, and still caught in the chemistry of its creation. But then somewhere in those restless seas, photosynthetic microbes began their slow and silent work, releasing oxygen molecule by molecule into the water. The iron that drifted there, so abundant, so restless, met this new element, and the meeting was immediate, violent, and beautiful. Iron turned to rust, sinking as flakes of reddish-brown dust toward the seafloor. The oceans began to paint themselves. Layer by layer, century by century, that iron settled, sometimes mingled with silicate muds, sometimes with volcanic ash, each layer marking a pulse in the planet's oxidation. Over time, they hardened into stone. The red bands are iron oxides, hematite and magnetite, while the grey and silver layers are chert, pure silica crystallized from the ancient seas. Together they form rhythmic patterns, a geological heartbeat that still echoes through the crust. These banded iron formations, or biafs, are the frozen record of the Great Oxidation Event, the proof that oxygen once rose like a tide through the ocean, transforming everything in its path. If you could stand beside one as it was forming, the world around you would feel utterly alien. The ocean would not be blue, but a cloudy mix of copper and green, dense with iron and minerals. As oxygen accumulated, microscopic rust storms would have fallen through the water, tiny particles glinting in the dim light, turning the sea into a shimmering red veil. The surface would glow faintly at sunset, reflecting the colors of oxidation, while the depths grew heavy and still. Every flake of rust that sank to the seafloor was a word in Earth's unfolding autobiography, a chemical syllable spelling out the story of transformation. These rocks, ancient and silent, still whisper that story today. If you run your hand along the polished surface of a bife, you can feel the rhythm of billions of years, the repetition of change, destruction, renewal. The red bands tell of oxygen's arrival, of life's first great exhalation. The grey bands tell of pauses, of quiet moments when iron ran low and the seas cleared. Together they are a conversation between chaos and calm, between death and rebirth. The Earth remembers in layers. It's astonishing to think that these formations, now quarried for iron to build our cities and machines, were once the byproduct of microbial labor. The metal in our buildings, our blood, our tools, all of it was first forged by the chemistry of ancient bacteria and the oxygen they released. Every beam of steel carries within it the ghost of the planet's first catastrophe and its first recovery. When we shape iron, we are, in a way, reshaping the memory of the Great Oxidation Event. We are working with the residue of Earth's awakening. Geologists find banded iron formations across the globe in the vast ranges of Western Australia, the Canadian Shield, the mountains of South Africa, Brazil, India, and the red heart of North America. They are scattered relics of a time when the oceans spoke a single chemical language. Wherever they appear, they tell the same tale: the sudden planetary embrace of oxygen and the collapse of the old, anoxic world. They are more than just evidence. They are a confession, written in stone, of how life reshaped its own environment. The Earth cannot lie about what happened. It has recorded everything. Each layer within a bife is an archive of atmosphere and ocean, a record of oxygen levels, microbial activity, and even the temperature of the seas. The thickness of the bands, their composition, and their global distribution reveal the pulse of oxygen's spread, slow at first, then surging, then settling into rhythm. When studied closely, these stones are not static. They move with time, carrying the breath of a planet in their iron veins. The red color that gives these formations their beauty is the color of oxidation, the color of reaction, the color of change. It is also, symbolically, the color of survival. For while the iron in these rocks marks destruction, the death of anaerobic ecosystems, it also marks creation, the building of something new. The iron oxides are tombstones and birth certificates at once, reminders that every transformation carries both loss and renewal. The bifes are Earth's diary entries from its adolescence, messy, dramatic, transformative, full of potential. Imagine, for a moment, the slow process of their formation stretched across billions of years. The Earth, covered in its green seas, quietly exhales oxygen. The oceans, patient but reactive, take in this breath and respond with rust. Each interaction leaves a trace. One molecule oxidized, one atom of iron bound, one grain of sediment settling. The process repeats endlessly, a rhythm of life and chemistry intertwined. Over time, the layers accumulate, compressed by the weight of the ocean and the slow drift of continents. What was once soft and fluid becomes solid and eternal. The seas wrote their story in rust, and the crust remembered. It is easy to think of these rocks as relics of a distant era, but in truth, they are living connections to our present. The iron that stains them red is the same iron that courses through our veins. The oxygen that rusted the seas is the same oxygen we breathe now. Every heartbeat, every breath, every spark of energy within our cells carries forward the chemistry that first filled the oceans with color. The banded iron formations are not just memories of the Earth. They are our memories too, written before our ancestors had form or name. In their silence lies something profound. Rocks do not speak, but they endure, and endurance is its own kind of language. The bifes have survived tectonic collisions, erosion, metamorphosis, and the rise and fall of continents. Yet they still bear the same message they did 2.5 billion years ago. That change is inevitable, that life reshapes what it touches, that beauty can come from catastrophe. When we look at their stripes, we are looking at time made visible, at the pulse of planetary life preserved in stone. There's a strange poetry to the idea that the planet itself keeps a journal, its entries written not in ink, but in mineral. Each red layer is an exclamation point, a cry of transformation, each grey one a breath of pause. Together they form a story too vast for any human language, yet so intimate that we can hold a piece of it in our hands. The Earth, it seems, remembers not in words but in colour, and the colours are breathtaking. Under the light, a banded iron formation glows like a horizon at dawn, crimson bleeding into silver, silver into deep maroon. The texture is smooth but alive, like silk turned to stone. Some layers are so thin they vanish when polished, others thick enough to catch the shadow of your reflection. It's easy to imagine the planet speaking through them, whispering softly, Remember this. I changed once, and I will change again. Even their distribution tells a story. Most of the world's banded iron formations date from a narrow window of time, roughly between 2.6 and 1.8 billion years ago, the era of the Great Oxidation Event. After that, they become rare. Once the oceans lost their supply of dissolved iron, the rusting stopped, the red bands ceased to form. The Earth had finished that chapter of its story. The very absence of new biofs in the rock record marks the moment oxygen had fully claimed the world. The oceans had cleared, and the process that painted the planet red was complete. The Earth, having written its memory, set down the pen. And yet, those memories persist, etched across the crust in quiet beauty. When we study them, we are not just reading geology, we are reading autobiography. The planet tells us how it became itself, how it endured its first great trial, how it turned destruction into creation. The biofs are the archives of that triumph. They remind us that every catastrophe leaves behind its art. Every ending leaves behind its record. The rust of the oceans became the script of survival. To the untrained eye, a slab of banded iron formation might seem ordinary, a pretty rock, a curiosity, but to those who listen closely, it is a voice. It tells of a time when the seas breathed iron and the air was poison, when life, tiny and unassuming, rewrote the chemistry of an entire planet. Tells of the birth of oxygen, the first extinction, and the first rebirth. It tells of resilience and patience and time. The next time you see one of these ancient stones, perhaps in a museum, perhaps on a mountain trail, pause for a moment, run your fingers over the layers, feel the alternating smoothness and roughness, the warmth of the red, the chill of the grey. You are touching the memory of 2.4 billion years ago, the echo of a world that drowned in its own invention and rose again. Each band is a heartbeat of the early Earth, each colour a whisper of its transformation. The rock does not speak aloud, but it remembers everything. Banded iron formations are the Earth's way of saying, I remember the day I turned red. They are not just the residue of oxidation, but the poetry of survival made solid. The iron within them once drifted free in the sea, dissolved and invisible, until oxygen gave it form. That same oxygen gave us breath. The same iron runs in our blood. When we hold these rocks, we are holding the first evidence of our own becoming. And so, in the rust-red shimmer of these ancient stones, we see both the catastrophe and the miracle, the end of one world, the beginning of another. The Earth, ever humble, left us these bands as proof that even destruction can create beauty, that even collapse can write memory. They are the Earth's quiet refrain, repeated across continents and ages. I changed, I endured, I remember. The climate lesson, the fragility of life. When the Earth first filled with oxygen, it was not a triumph, it was a warning. The Great Oxidation Event was the planet's first great reminder that life and climate are not separate forces, but a single interwoven system, each shaping the other with every breath and heartbeat. It was the first time chemistry tipped the balance of the world. What began as the slow work of microbial photosynthesis, oxygen, molecule by molecule, became a storm that remade oceans, air and stone. It was a planetary experiment that went too far too fast. In its aftermath, life vanished by the billions. The atmosphere had changed, and so had everything that depended on it. That moment, billions of years ago, is not as distant from us as it seems. The same delicate interconnections still hold the world together today. The same risk of imbalance still waits. Oxygen once brought crisis. Now the threat comes from carbon. Where cyanobacteria once filled the seas with oxygen, we now fill the air with carbon dioxide, an invisible transformation as slow, as powerful, and as dangerous. It is easy to think of these gases as abstractions, numbers on charts, percentages in the atmosphere, but they are not abstract. They are the language of the planet's metabolism. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, methane. Each molecule is a word in a story the Earth has been telling for 4.5 billion years. When that story changes too suddenly, the planet shudders. Today, we live in the midst of another chemical awakening. In just a few centuries, barely a blink in geological time, our species has shifted the balance of the atmosphere more than natural processes once did over millions of years. The air now holds over 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide, a level not seen in millions of years. That number seems small, but the Earth listens closely. Tiny changes in atmospheric composition can alter temperature, rainfall, ocean chemistry, and the distribution of life itself. The planet's systems are sensitive, exquisitely tuned by deep time, and easily disturbed. The Great Oxidation Event offers a mirror, a deep, ancient precedent. Then it was oxygen that surged uncontrollably, oxidizing the seas, stripping methane from the air, plunging the world into glaciation. Now it is carbon dioxide that rises unchecked, trapping heat, melting ice, and thickening the blanket around the planet. Both are examples of the same truth. When a gas that regulates planetary balance changes too quickly, the climate swings, ecosystems falter, and stability collapses. The Earth's resilience has limits, and those limits are defined by chemistry. Every planet has its tipping points. The Earth's history is a series of them, moments when small shifts cascaded into revolutions. The rise of oxygen was one, the onset of ice ages another, the great extinction events that followed volcanic outbursts or asteroid impacts. Still others, these tipping points are thresholds, delicate as glass, beyond which feedback loops spiral out of control. Methane released from thawing permafrost feeds warming, which releases more methane. Melting ice reduces reflectivity, which absorbs more heat, which melts more ice. Like a seesaw that suddenly tips, the planet's balance can lurch in a single direction until an entirely new equilibrium emerges. In the Great Oxidation Event, the tipping point came when the oceans could no longer absorb oxygen as fast as microbes produced it. The balance flipped, and the world turned red. We often imagine the Earth as vast and unbreakable, a giant, self-correcting organism capable of enduring anything. And it is true that the planet itself will survive whatever changes come. The rocks will persist, the continents will shift, the stars will continue to rise, but the balance that sustains life, the thin film of gases, the fragile patterns of temperature and water, is not indestructible. It is delicate, dynamic, and easily overturned. The oxygen crisis taught that lesson once before. Today, the carbon crisis teaches it again. It is not the chemistry itself that is cruel. Chemistry is indifferent. Oxygen did not mean to suffocate the early microbes any more than carbon dioxide means to warm the seas. The cruelty lies in speed. Evolution can adapt to slow change. It thrives on it. But when the environment shifts faster than life can respond, extinction follows. The Great Oxidation Event unfolded over tens of millions of years, and even that was enough to overwhelm nearly all anaerobic life. What we are doing now is orders of magnitude faster. In just 2 centuries, we have altered the climate more abruptly than any event since the end of the dinosaurs. The scale of change is planetary, but the pace is human. And yet, the comparison holds more than warning. It holds wisdom. The Great Oxidation Event showed not only the fragility of life, but its resilience. When oxygen flooded the seas, most organisms perished, but a few adapted. They invented new biochemistry, learned to use oxygen, and turned poison into power. They rebuilt the web of life from the ruins of the old. The same potential lies within the biosphere now. Life will endure. It always has. But the form that endurance takes, whether it is diverse and flourishing or diminished and struggling, depends on what we do. Our modern atmosphere is an inheritance of both miracle and risk. The same oxygen that once destroyed life now sustains it. The same carbon that once warmed the young planet now threatens to overheat it. These gases are partners and rivals, dancing in constant interplay. The balance between them defines everything. The color of the sky, the shape of the climate, the breath in our lungs. To live on Earth is to live inside this fragile equilibrium, dependent on it for every breath, every meal, every heartbeat. We are not outside the system, we are within it, bound by the same physics that once reshaped the ancient seas. In this light, climate change is not just an environmental problem. It is a reawakening of planetary memory. It is the Earth reminding us that chemistry is destiny, that gases can be both gifts and warnings. When the balance tips, the world does not end. It transforms. The question is not whether the planet can change. It always will, but whether we can change with it. The oxygen catastrophe reminds us that tipping points once passed cannot be easily reversed. When the seas rusted, There was no going back to the green, iron-rich world that came before. The system found a new equilibrium, one that supported different forms of life but erased countless others. Today, the carbon tipping points loom just as large: melting permafrost, collapsing coral reefs, shifting rainfall, vanishing ice sheets. Each of these systems holds a threshold beyond which feedback accelerates and restoration becomes nearly impossible. Once crossed, the planet moves on to its next state, indifferent to our desire to return. Still, the story of oxygen offers more than despair. It reminds us that life's greatest strength lies in adaptation. Even when the world changed beyond recognition, something always found a way to endure. The first aerobic cells were accidents of survival, yet from them came forests, oceans of fish, civilizations, and thought. The catastrophe that seemed to end everything instead created the foundation for all that followed. It is a reminder that while climate can destroy, it can also inspire transformation. In our own time, the challenge is not to survive the shift, but to soften it, to guide the planet's chemistry rather than surrender to it. We now have the knowledge to see the patterns that ancient life could not. We can measure gases, trace isotopes, model temperatures, and foresee outcomes. We have, for the first time, the ability to understand what the early microbes never did, that every emission, every molecule released, contributes to the balance of the whole. That awareness carries weight, turns us from bystanders into participants, from accidental agents of change into potential caretakers of stability. The Earth is resilient, but resilience has limits. The lesson of the Great Oxidation Event is not that catastrophe is inevitable. It is that imbalance always has consequences. When life alters its environment faster than it can adapt, the planet responds with correction, often severe. Oxygen was that correction once. Carbon may be it again. The difference is that now we are the oxygen makers, the shapers of imbalance. The question is whether we will act with intention or let chemistry choose for us. There is humility in realizing how small the boundary between thriving and collapse truly is. Few percentage points of oxygen once remade the planet. A few hundred parts per million of carbon dioxide are reshaping it now. The line between stability and chaos is measured not in miles or centuries, but in molecules. The atmosphere is thin, just a fragile veil, barely 1% of Earth's radius, and within that veil lies everything we know as life. Every forest, every breath, every dream depends on that whisper of air. It is the thinnest thread, and yet it holds the weight of worlds. We stand within that thread's tension, pulled between past and future. The Earth has tipped before, and it will again. The difference is that this time, the catalyst is conscious. We are the first species capable of understanding the climate's fragility, and therefore the first capable of preserving it. The Great Oxidation Event was an accident of biology. Our carbon age is an act of will. That distinction is both our burden and our power. If you listen carefully beneath the noise of engines, the hum of cities, the chatter of progress, you can still hear the planet breathing. It inhales our carbon and exhales our fate. It responds not with anger, but with chemistry, the same way it always has. And within that chemistry lies a quiet truth. Balance is never permanent. It must be tended, renewed, respected. The lesson oxygen left in the rocks, in the rust of the old seas, is that even the most stable systems can break if pushed too far. The planet does not punish, it recalibrates. So when we look at our changing climate, our warming oceans, shifting storms, vanishing ice, we are not seeing something new, we are seeing an echo, a memory resurfaced from 2.5 billion years ago, when another invisible gas changed the course of life. The oxygen revolution was the first reminder that power without restraint can unmake the world. The carbon revolution is the second. Both are warnings, both are chances to learn. The fragility of life is not weakness, it is sensitivity, the ability to respond, to adapt, to evolve. It is what allowed life to endure the first atmospheric catastrophe, and it is what may allow it to endure this one. But the window for adaptation is small. The atmosphere changes faster than evolution moves. We can slow that change, or we can watch it overtake us. Either way, the planet will continue. but the story we write upon it will depend on whether we remember the lessons hidden in stone. The red rocks of ancient Earth carry those lessons still. They whisper across time that chemistry remembers, that every breath counts, that the balance between creation and destruction is as thin as air. The Great Oxidation Event was not only the birth of oxygen, it was the birth of awareness, the first evidence that life could change its world. We are its descendants, living through a new chapter of the same tale. The gases have changed, but the question remains, can life once again find a way to endure its own creation? The Earth has already whispered the answer, softly but clearly. Be careful, but do not fear. The systems that sustain you are delicate, but they are also resilient. They can bend, but not forever. They can heal, but not infinitely. The planet remembers what imbalance can do. It carries that memory in the rust-red layers of its crust, in the chemistry of its air, in the rhythm of its seasons. Oxygen once reshaped it. Carbon is reshaping it now. The warning is the same. The chance to act is ours. Hope from the past, rebirth after catastrophe. There are stories written in fire and storms, and there are stories written in patience. The Earth remembers both. Among its oldest memories, buried deep within ancient stone and rust-red layers, lies a tale not only of disaster, but of endurance. A story of how life met death, adapted, and began again. The Great Oxidation Event, though born in chaos, was also the seed of renewal. Out of the suffocating oceans, through the haze of poison and rust, life reimagined itself. From that transformation came every breath we take, every leaf that reaches for the sun, every thought ever dreamed beneath the blue sky. We are not the children of stability. We are the descendants of survival. Billions of years ago, the Earth nearly lost itself. The rise of oxygen had unbalanced the chemistry of the oceans, collapsing ecosystems that had thrived for eons. The green, iron-rich seas turned red and barren. The air grew reactive, burning away the gases that had once shielded life. For countless generations, the biosphere teetered on the edge of extinction. Yet, it did not end. Life bent, but it did not break. Some microbes learned to tolerate oxygen, others discovered how to wield it. In those small, silent adaptations, the future began. Evolution is not a straight line, it is a spiral turning through catastrophe toward complexity. The survivors of the oxygen crisis carried within them the tools to build something new. They found ways to protect themselves from oxygen's destructive force, inventing enzymes to neutralize its reactivity. Then, astonishingly, they began to use it, to draw energy from it, to turn respiration into power. This was not just survival, it was transformation. Oxygen became the fuel for a new kind of life, richer, faster, more intricate. From that chemistry emerged the eukaryotic cell, the foundation of all multicellular beings to come. In that moment, evolution found a new canvas. Every complex organism that has ever existed, every tree, every whale, every human owes its existence to those ancient experiments. The catastrophe that once smothered the seas became the reason life could grow larger, think deeper, and endure longer. In the ashes of collapse, biology discovered imagination. The Great Oxidation Event did not destroy life, it sculpted it. If you look at the fossil record, the story unfolds like a slow symphony of recovery. For millions of years after the crisis, the Earth was quiet. Oxygen levels stabilized at modest levels, and microbial communities rebuilt their network. Slowly, eukaryotic cells diversified, forming colonies, then tissues, then bodies. The first multicellular organisms appeared, fragile, translucent forms drifting in the dark oceans, feeding on light and chemistry. They were the first architects of complexity, and though they left few fossils, their legacy is everywhere. They were the rehearsal for the grand experiment of animal life that would follow. That experiment eventually produced us. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought we have is a continuation of the pattern that began in that distant age of oxygen. Inside your cells, mitochondria, the descendants of ancient aerobic bacteria, still perform the same miracle of respiration, turning air and food into energy. In every inhalation, you are repeating the act that first reshaped the world. The past lives within you, written not in myth, but in molecules. The evidence of this story lies all around us, locked in the Earth's crust. Geologists read it like scripture, layers of rock, sediments, and isotopes that chronicle not only what happened, but how life responded. The banded iron formations tell of the first breath. The carbon isotopes record the rise and fall of life. The clay and silt capture the whispers of ancient oceans. These are not merely stones, they are the planet's diaries, written in the slow language of minerals. And from them we learn that catastrophe is not the end. It is a form of creation. Science gives us the gift of seeing this continuity. Through microscopes and mass spectrometers, through ice cores and seafloor drills, we glimpse the threads that bind our present to those ancient worlds. We see that every collapse in Earth's history has been followed by renewal, slower than our lifetimes but inevitable in its patience. The planet's story is not one of endless destruction, but of endurance through change. The oxygen catastrophe, the snowball Earths, the volcanic winters, the asteroid impacts, all of them cleared the stage for something new to emerge. Life did not retreat from these trials. It evolved because of them. This pattern holds a quiet comfort. It tells us that the capacity for renewal is built into the fabric of the Earth itself. The systems that sustain life are fragile, yes, but they are also dynamic, capable of reinventing themselves. Adaptation is not a choice for life. It is its nature. When conditions shift, genes shift with them. When oxygen rose, life rewrote its chemistry. When continents collided, life moved with them. When climates froze or burned, life found niches in the cracks. Every era of destruction has become a chapter in creation, and perhaps the most remarkable outcome of that resilience is awareness. Out of the ancient oceans of rust and storm came organisms that could sense, remember, and eventually understand. The same molecules that once poisoned the planet now flow through neurons, carrying thoughts, emotions, and dreams. Oxygen, once a harbinger of death, became the enabler of consciousness. The catastrophe that nearly erased life set the stage for reflection itself, for the ability to look back, to wonder, and to learn. When we study the Great Oxidation Event, we are not merely studying rocks and chemistry, we are studying the roots of meaning. The story of oxygen is the story of transformation, of how the planet itself can evolve, and how life can turn adversity into advantage. It is the oldest example we have of hope as a force of nature. The same process that once destroyed entire biospheres now gives us the breath to speak of them. Modern science continues to decode this resilience, drilling into ancient seabeds. Researchers retrieve core samples that capture the slow rhythm of Earth's heartbeat. Each layer a record of temperature, oxygen levels, and biological activity. Through these cores we can trace the moment oxygen first surged, the pause when it fell, and the rise when it stabilized. We can see the fingerprints of microbial life in the isotopic ratios of carbon and sulfur. These lines of data are not abstract. They are whispers from our planetary ancestors, telling us how they endured their own crises. Through these studies, we come to understand that the Earth is not fragile because it changes. It is alive because it does. The balance between destruction and creation is its way of breathing, a cycle written into the geology and the biology alike. To know this is to see hope not as naive optimism, but as recognition that the world has already faced worse, and from it, life has always found a way. If you hold a piece of banded iron formation, or a shale rich with fossilized microbes, you are holding proof that disaster and renewal are not opposites, but companions. The iron that once rained down as rust from the poisoned seas now forms the core of mountains and the blood of animals. The oxygen that once annihilated ecosystems now sustains forests and coral reefs. The same chemistry that brought extinction also made evolution possible. There is poetry in that, but there is also guidance. Nature's memory is long, and it always leans toward life. Even today, the processes of rebirth continue in ways we can observe. After volcanic eruptions, new soils form from ash. After coral bleaching, fragments regenerate and rebuild. After forests burn, seeds germinate in the cracks of charcoal. These are not isolated miracles. They are echoes of the same resilience that followed the Great Oxidation Event. The Earth's ability to recover is not infinite, but it is profound. It waits patiently for balance to return, and when it does, life answers. Our understanding of this cycle has grown deeper with every generation of science. We now map oxygen isotopes in glacial ice to trace the rise and fall of atmosphere. We analyze carbon in ocean sediments to follow the rhythm of ancient climates. We use satellite data to measure the same feedbacks that once shaped the Proterozoic world. Each discovery links us more intimately to the Earth's past, and each one reminds us that we are part of this ongoing experiment. To study the past is not to escape it, but to learn how to protect the future. In every laboratory and field site, in every microscope and model, there is a quiet echo of that ancient resilience. Scientists are not just measuring gases or cataloguing fossils, they are listening to the Earth's voice, a voice that has spoken through catastrophe and silence alike. It says, "I have changed, I have endured, I will continue." And within that message lies a challenge. Will we honor the patience that created us? The hope of the Great Oxidation Event is not that life survived by chance, but that it adapted through creativity. The microbes that invented respiration did not resist change. They embraced it. They turned destruction into energy. In that act, they became the architects of everything to come. The same spirit of innovation still exists within us. Every act of science, every effort to understand the planet's rhythms is an echo of that ancient creativity. By learning from the past, we continue the story those microbes began. So when we look up at the blue sky, the color that oxygen made possible, we are seeing both the memory of crisis and the promise of renewal. The same gas that once scoured the planet now cradles it. The same chemistry that once ended life now sustains it. The Earth has already shown us that rebirth follows destruction, that from imbalance comes equilibrium, and that life, no matter how fragile, carries the instinct to begin again. And so, the Great Oxidation Event is not just a chapter of extinction, it is the first chapter of resilience. It is the reason the world is breathable, the reason the seas are blue, the reason we are here to wonder at all. It reminds us that hope is not found in the absence of catastrophe, but in the persistence that follows it. Every fossil, every rock core, every layer of rusted stone is a testament to that truth. The Earth remembers its wounds, but it also remembers its healing. If you listen closely to the rust-red rocks, to the hum of the wind, to the steady rhythm of your own breath, you can still hear the whisper that has carried through billions of years. Adapt, endure, begin again. It is the oldest instruction life has ever written, and the most powerful. The Earth, patient as always, continues to whisper, "I survived. You can too." Philosophy, oxygen and the meaning of life. If you pause for a moment, perhaps now, as you breathe, you might notice how silent the act really is. The inhale, the exhale, the invisible rhythm that sustains you. It feels effortless, automatic, ancient. Yet within that simple exchange lies the history of catastrophe and renewal, of death transformed into possibility. Every breath you take carries the memory of a time when oxygen was not a gift but a curse. To breathe is to participate in a story billions of years old, written not in ink or language, but in molecules and endurance. Oxygen, the element that once nearly erased life, became the very symbol of it. And within that irony lies a philosophy so deep it humbles the mind, that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the great experiment of existence. In the beginning, oxygen was chaos. It was fire without flame, invisible and merciless. When it first appeared, it tore apart the delicate fabrics of cells that had never known its touch. It oxidized, corroded, dismantled. For the early microbes of Earth, oxygen was a toxin, a molecular predator slipping silently into their chemistry. They suffocated not from lack, but from excess. In their demise, the planet seemed to fall still. Yet, as with all endings, something stirred within the silence. A few survivors, fragile and clever, learned to bend the enemy to their will. They discovered how to make use of it, how to channel oxygen's violence into energy. In doing so, they rewrote the purpose of existence itself. From poison came breath. From ruin came vitality. From death, life learned to build anew. This perhaps is the first and oldest parable of the universe, that transformation is the root of all meaning. Nothing remains untouched. Even destruction, given time, becomes creation. The Great Oxidation Event was not just a shift in chemistry, it was an awakening. It was the first time the planet's own processes turned inward, and began to change themselves. Life altered its environment, and in turn was altered by it. There is no clearer reflection of existence than this dance between the maker and the made. Every inhale you take continues that ancient rhythm, the merging of the inner and outer world, the act of exchange that defines being. To live is to transform and to be transformed in return. Oxygen is a mirror. It shows us the dual nature of everything we call life, the fragility that allows change and the resilience that ensures survival. It is both the thread that binds and the blade that cuts. Its presence on Earth reminds us that even the forces that sustain us can destroy us if balance is lost. And yet, without that tension, there could be no growth, no complexity, no consciousness. The meaning of oxygen is not comfort, but contrast. It embodies the paradox at the heart of existence, that we survive only by embracing what once threatened to end us. Consider how every breath is an act of trust. We take in oxygen knowing it could burn, but also knowing that it sustains us. Inside our cells, that same molecule dances dangerously close to chaos, its electrons snatched and shared in the delicate machinery of metabolism. Life is built upon that edge, a molecular tightrope between energy and annihilation. It has always been this way. From the first cyanobacteria to the rise of mammals, existence has depended on balance, on the ability to hold destruction close enough to feel its warmth without letting it consume us. The philosophy of oxygen is at its core the philosophy of restraint. We are the outcome of this ancient chemistry, the living descendants of those first survivors who made peace with poison. When oxygen became a partner instead of a predator, evolution found its footing. Cells grew more intricate, bodies more capable, minds more curious. Out of molecular struggle came the capacity for thought, love, wonder, to think, to imagine, to feel awe at the stars. All of it traces back to that primal negotiation between death and adaptation. We are, in a very literal sense, the consciousness of oxygen, the way the universe became aware of its own breath. There's a strange humility in recognizing that. We often imagine ourselves as masters of the natural world, separate from its ancient laws. Yet the truth is far simpler and far more beautiful. We are products of its accidents. Every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of thought is a continuation of choices made long before we were born, choices made by cells, by atoms, by time itself. We did not invent meaning, we inherited it. Oxygen carved it into our existence before we ever spoke its name. To reflect on oxygen is to reflect on impermanence. Every living thing that breathes will one day stop, returning its elements to the cycle that began in those ancient seas. The atoms of oxygen that pass through you today once drifted through the lungs of countless creatures, through forests and oceans, through stone and flame. They are older than your species, older than your planet's mountains, older than the idea of death itself. They have seen everything and remember nothing, yet they carry the signature of all that has ever lived. When you breathe, you are joining that continuum, becoming part of the unbroken story of transformation that stretches back to the beginning of time. The philosopher and the scientist might say oxygen is not merely a gas, it is memory in motion. It is the invisible historian of life, circulating endlessly between organism and environment, between past and future. Every molecule of it has witnessed the Earth's cess from chaos, its plunge into ice, its slow thaw into abundance. It is both the instrument and the record of existence. And in its ceaseless movement, it teaches us something profound, that nothing truly disappears, only changes form. The oxygen that once killed now sustains, the carbon that once choked now nourishes. The universe recycles its own meaning. This is not simply chemistry, it is continuity. The same cycles that govern the stars and planets govern us. The respiration of galaxies and organisms follow the same principle. Energy flows, matter transforms, and balance must be kept. In this way, the Great Oxidation Event is more than history. It is an allegory for the entire cosmos. Creation and destruction are not separate forces, they are two halves of a single process. Stars explode to forge heavier elements, and those elements give rise to life. Life consumes and renews itself, shaping the environment that sustains it. Every catastrophe becomes the seed of a new order. Oxygen is the whisper of that eternal pattern. the quiet reminder that every ending is a form of beginning. And so when we ask what it means to live, perhaps the answer lies here, in the breath itself. To live is to exchange, to participate in the constant dialogue between the self and the world. You inhale what was once another's exhale. You release what another will need to survive. You are never alone in this process. Every breath binds you to the oceans that first produced oxygen, to the trees that now replenish it, to the animals and strangers who share it with you. It is the most democratic act in the universe, shared equally by all, belonging to none. In that shared breath lies the essence of connection, the truth that life is never solitary. Oxygen also reminds us that existence is never without risk. Each generation inherits a world shaped by the breath of those before it, and each must decide what balance to maintain. The early microbes could not predict the consequences of their own success, just as we cannot always foresee the impact of ours. The atmosphere is not only a gift, but a responsibility. It is a mirror of our choices, a reflection of our collective balance or imbalance with the natural world. The story of oxygen warns that abundance without awareness can lead to collapse, and yet it also promises that from collapse, new forms of balance can emerge. It is both caution and comfort, depending on how deeply we choose to listen. Perhaps that is the ultimate meaning oxygen offers. Awareness. Awareness that life is fragile, yet enduring. Awareness that destruction and creation are inseparable. Awareness that we too are agents of transformation, shaping our environment even as it shapes us. To breathe is to participate in that awareness, to acknowledge in every inhale that we are sustained by forces older and greater than ourselves. To exhale is to contribute something back to them. It is a conversation without words, a dialogue between chemistry and consciousness. In this light, oxygen is more than an element. It is a metaphor for awakening. It turned a planet of silence into one of sound, a world of chemistry into a world of meaning. The moment it entered the atmosphere, it set into motion everything that would follow: the rise of complex life, the emergence of thought, the question of existence itself. In a sense, oxygen is the first philosopher. It asked without words how life could survive transformation, how order could emerge from chaos. And the answer, given slowly over billions of years, is the story of us. If the earth could speak, perhaps it would say, life is not fragile because it breaks. It is fragile because it bends, and bending is what allows it to endure. Oxygen taught that lesson first. It showed that survival is not resistance, but adaptation, that meaning is not permanence, but persistence. To exist is to change, to risk, to embrace uncertainty. The first cells that dared to use oxygen were the first to understand that to live is to walk alongside death and make peace with it. Their courage, though unspoken, is written in every breath we take. And so, oxygen's story is not just about the chemistry of survival, it is about the nature of being. It teaches us that meaning arises not from safety, but from transformation, not from perfection, but from persistence. It reminds us that beauty is born from tension, that life in all its forms is both fleeting and eternal. The same molecule that once destroyed the world now sustains poets, scientists, dreamers, and wanderers. The air that carries our songs once carried the breath of ancient oceans. The act of breathing is not just biological, it is an act of communion with time itself. To understand oxygen is to understand the paradox of existence, that we are made of the same forces that threaten to undo us. We are the living proof that chaos can learn harmony, that fire can become breath, that death can give rise to thought. Every inhale is an echo of the first oxidation. Every exhale, a promise that the story continues. When you breathe again, slowly, quietly, listen. The air that fills you has been here before. It has passed through the lungs of dinosaurs, through forests long vanished, through oceans of ancient microbes. It carries whispers from the past and possibilities for the future. It is the universe reminding you that you are part of its eternal cycle of destruction and renewal. Oxygen is not simply what keeps you alive, it is what gives your existence meaning. And perhaps if you listen closely enough, you might hear the earth's ancient whisper, soft, patient, and endlessly wise, saying, "Keep breathing. The story isn't over." And now, as the tides of this story ebb, we return to where it all began, with a silent earth shrouded in clouds of gas, breathing without oxygen beneath a dim young sun. Once, there was no air fit to breathe, no blue sky, no whisper of wind through leaves, only a planet wrapped in its own volcanic haze, its oceans thick and green, its world still dreaming in chemistry. Life was there, tiny, unseen, ancient, living in the deep dark, sustained by warmth and minerals, unaware that the air above it would one day become its undoing. Then came the great transformation. Oxygen, an invisible revolution, rose from the seas, one breath at a time. What began as creation became catastrophe. The Great Oxidation Event swept through the world like a silent fire, oxidizing the oceans, burning away the old gases, and smothering the creatures that had never known its touch. The seas turned red with rust, the sky brightened, and for a time it seemed as if life had ended. But the earth was patient. From that stillness, life learned to breathe again. The survivors, fragile yet fierce, found new ways to live. They tamed oxygen's fire, turned it into strength, and began to build anew. From their resilience came complexity, from microbes, cells with purpose, from those cells the foundations of all we know. The catastrophe became creation's turning point. The world did not perish, it evolved. The very air that once killed became the cradle of everything to come. Through the eons, the earth healed itself. The red oceans faded to blue, the sky turned clear, and the air filled with the rhythm of breath. From those breaths came forests, creatures, and much later us, each of us carrying the same oxygen that once threatened to erase existence. Every inhale you take is the echo of that ancient transformation, the continuation of a story older than time's memory. You are, in a quiet and cosmic way, a child of the Great Oxidation, the living proof that even destruction can give rise to beauty. Oxygen's tale is a soft reminder of fragility and strength. It teaches that every balance is temporary, that even the smallest changes can shift the fate of worlds. But it also whispers that life is persistent, that it bends, transforms, and endures. It tells us that from endings, beginnings are born, and from loss, creation blooms. The planet has always known this rhythm, the inhale of catastrophe, the exhale of renewal. And if you listen carefully beyond the hum of your own breath, you can still hear it, the heartbeat of a world that survived itself. Now, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that ancient ocean once more. Picture it under a dim sun, its surface glowing red with iron, rippling gently in the planetary dusk. Each wave carries the memory of change, of life's first defiance, of Earth's long exhale. The rust-colored sea whispers softly across time, I remember, I endured, I began again. Let that whisper cradle you. Let it remind you that fragility is not weakness, but the beginning of resilience, that even the smallest breath can carry the weight of worlds. The story of oxygen is not one of despair, but of renewal, a lullaby written in rust, carried by the wind, sung by the planet itself. So breathe slowly and deeply. Feel the air, ancient and eternal, pass through you as it once passed through oceans and stone. You are part of the same rhythm, the same song. The earth is still breathing with you. And as the world outside grows quiet, and your own breath softens into sleep, imagine the red seas fading into blue, the skies clearing, the first light of dawn rising over a planet reborn. The great oxidation is long past, but its music remains in every cell, in every cloud, in every heartbeat. The earth, ever gentle, hums its final lullaby. From fire to breath, from chaos to calm, from silence to song, rest now. The world remembers. Sleep and dream beneath the ancient sky. Good night. Breathe easy, dream deeply, and if you wake, remember, you are made from the air that once remade the world, and the earth in its endless patience is still whispering to you, softly, kindly, keep breathing.